Gentlemen, this is something I guess new for myself, and I firstly want to thank you all for coming on and having a discussion with me. Now that I'm not in Ukraine, I'm currently in Paris in France. But as far as the three guys who I know, who probably know like the most information and have, really solid sort of objective opinions on what's happening, are you three, and I consume all your content independently, even though I'm friends with you. But I was really going to give like a quick, I guess, update on what's happening. And like in the last week, so much has changed in Ukraine and what's happening. But if I could just like have yourselves introduce who you are. We'll start with yourself, John. Like a quick sort of who you are, what you do, where you are.
Try and pack it in.
Pretty much.
So I'm John. I'm the founder and director of Trident Defense Initiative. We are a Ukraine-based training company, training foundation. We're a non-profit. And we focus predominantly on training the Ukrainian military in tactical and medical skills. We've been doing that since really the first week of the war. And now we're at the point where we're now the largest volunteer-based training organization in Ukraine. I myself, I'm a former Ukrainian Marine, former British Army soldier, and I spent time as a medical volunteer in places like Syria, Burma, and Colombia. So it's a small dive into my background.
Yeah. And Ryan, yourself?
My name's Ryan McBeth. I was an infantryman for about 20 years, mainly anti-tank infantry. Now I'm a software engineer and cybersecurity guy, and I also have a YouTube channel where I do open source intelligence and cybersecurity topics.
Emile?
I'm Emile Ghesson, a former British Royal Marine Commando, now a documentary filmmaker, covering war zones across the world, and I've just spent the last 7 months covering the war in Ukraine.
And if you're following me, you don't know who I am. I'm Matt Williams. I spent 6.5 years in the Australian infantry, and I've spent off and on pretty much the last 6 months in Ukraine filming on the ground, although I'm not there at the moment. I've had the pleasure of meeting these gentlemen. So look, in the last week, we've had a lot. We've had pretty much the mobilization of the Russians. We've had a massive prisoner exchange, which at least for me was something I wasn't expecting. But I think the first thing I might talk about is that prisoner exchange, because for me, I feel like that sort of came out of the blue. And I just want to put it like to the floor against, how that happened and what the feeling tends to be around that.
Yeah, so the prisoner exchange, where we believe 215 were released from the Ukrainian side. Not sure if it's been confirmed how many went back to the Russians. Was a bit of a surprise for a lot of us because it happened on the day that Putin actually announced mobilization of 300,000 men. And so it's very key. Why did he announce it on that day? Why was a swap? Was that swap in process to be on that day? And then obviously Putin's speech was delayed by 12 hours. So it was on the following day. So yeah, it's very instrumental and very interesting on why it happened that day. Also, one thing I'll mention about majority of the men that released were from the Mariupol region. And we all know the Russians have been going on about this war, saying it's a war against Nazism. They're fighting against Nazis. So it's interesting, actually, the guys are supposed to be fighting, they all of a sudden released several hundred of them. So yeah, but Dan knows some of the guys as well, John, Shaun and Aiden, that we know personally. It's great to see that these guys are back to their family.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was obviously a big shock to everyone, like Emile said. Yeah, I know a lot of the foreign guys that were released personally, as well as a lot of the Ukrainians. My battalion commander, my platoon commander were released, Ukrainians, including obviously the foreign guys. Came as a shock to everyone, especially when it looked like it was a stage of ramping up the war. And obviously, if you look back at some of the main justifications for a lot of things in the past 8 years, and one of the biggest justifications of starting this war on February the 24th was the Nazi aspect. So obviously a big thing comes down to that with Azov. Obviously that's a whole separate topic, how they've been portrayed in Western Russian media and compared to how they actually are and who they represent and what they stand for. But I would say the Russians' most valuable prisoner, or their sort of rallying call prisoner, was Radis Denis, who is the commander of Azov Battalion. The fact that the foreigners are a separate thing, it was almost a separate prisoner exchange, but the fact that the commanders of Azov and the acting commander of 36th Brigade, my former brigade, were released was the most shocking thing. Obviously, you could see the foreigners being released separately under some sort of separate program, just because they're foreigners. But to coincide with also the release of most of the Azovstal defenders, or the prominent Azovstal defenders, as well as people that surrendered in the Ilich metallurgy factory, was a big shock to everyone. The reasons behind it would be very hard to say. There's certain clauses with it. For instance, like commanders and the commander of 36th Brigade, they have to remain in Turkey for the duration of the war, so they can't, take up arms again. And obviously, the exchange really tilted on Medvedchuk, Viktor Medvedchuk being released, who's obviously quite closely connected with Putin, was deemed to be the new leader of Ukraine if Russia were to install their own government, if they were to capture Kiev, capture Ukraine. But weeks before, the Russians said they didn't want him. So it's really an open question why it was done. If it was done without the mobilization, I'd say it was a wind down of the war. But with the mobilization, it's a very curious subject.
Do you think that any of that had to do with Russia running these referendums at the moment? Because at least if how I saw it was, say, with Aiden and Shaun, it was they were being held in the DPR, and if the British a swap with them would legitimize the Donetsk People's Republic government in some way, that if they're trying to have a referendum and bring those into Russia, then they wouldn't be POWs in the DPR, they'd be then POWs in Russia, and that would be under completely different status and different, I guess, legitimate government from the DPR. Would that have anything to do with it?
When you think about it, oh, I'm sorry.
No, you could. I wanted you to jump in. That's better.
Russia doesn't have a death penalty, kind of. I believe they've had a moratorium on the death penalty for, I want to say, almost 19 or so years. I think I actually wonder if it might have something to do with that. Like maybe these guys, maybe the DPR was actually going to carry this out, and once Russia took control of that region, now they can't carry it out. And that could have been a political problem. So maybe just the best thing to do is to get those guys out of there in a prisoner exchange.
Yeah.
Yeah, I since the day one that they're being threatened, or they went in front of the courts for execution, or that, I never thought it would ever materialize. I thought it was very much a Russian game of propaganda, like they normally do, to ramp it up to say this is what's going to happen. We got to bear in mind that thousands of men have traveled to Ukraine to take up arms to fight. Yeah. Obviously, some of the guys we're talking about here were in Ukraine previous to the war. They came in 2017, 2018. They're slightly different to the international battalions that they're now. But I think it was really a rhetoric that was coming out of Moscow to say, okay, right, if you guys keep coming here, this is your fate. And look at the guys we've got sat behind this cage who are going to go to the firing squad. So I think it was more of a message. I knew, well, I didn't know, but I presumed that they'd be used as leverage somehow against the British and American governments and also the other nationalities. So, yeah. But the psychological effect that these men have probably been through, even today I was watching Shaun and Aiden on television today talking about their time in captivity. It's going to take them years to recover from that.
I think a lot of it comes down to, like Ryan said, obviously the memorandum on the death penalty, which was included in the Donetsk People's Republic. From speaking to Aiden and Shaun directly, it seems a lot of their initial capture was with the separatists, but as the months went on, they were more under the Russian care, or the Russian, care is the wrong word for it, but there's definitely a direct influence of the two parties rather than just the Donetsk People's Republic holding it all. It doesn't really change anything if Russia do, and I think Russia, I'd like to think they're smart enough to understand that even if they hold these referendums, it won't really change anything for them. It won't change anything positively for them, because it won't reduce the amount of strikes being carried out on those regions, HIMARS, etc. It's not really going to put Russia in a position where they can justifiably, potentially use nuclear weapons or potentially ramp up the conflict. And obviously, that's a question towards mobilization. Can they ramp up the conflict? So obviously, there's the fog of war and the sway of the propaganda. You're obviously going to predominantly see drunks and badly equipped mobilized soldiers, but that probably isn't the whole of it. That's just what we're seeing. That's what we're getting filtered through, is these videos, because it suits the propaganda that we should be consuming. So it doesn't mean that this, however many people being mobilized, are all unmotivated, drunk, fighting people and protesting. There probably is a large number that are also, willing to fight and willing to be mobilized. So I don't know. There isn't really a firm reason where you can say this is why they released the guys, because it doesn't really do them any favors. And it's also a big morale loss to the Russians. I follow a lot of Russian Telegram groups. I'm sure everyone in here does. And they were very disappointed by the fact they've been released. Obviously, you're justifying a war to people. You're saying, we're going to fight against Nazism. Azov Battalion are the biggest Nazis. We, heroically, they call it heroically, but destroying the entire city of Mariupol and then being held back for months by a few thousand hardcore fighters who are under-equipped and malnourished makes them look pathetic. But at the end of the day, they did win in Mariupol in some way. They got those prisoners, high-value prisoners, and then they've just given them up, especially for someone like Medvedchuk, which won't resonate to the average Russian person. They go, why the hell do we need Medvedchuk? We've got the Nazi commander, the Gold Shrine of Ukrainian Nazis.
Also, what we need to remember is we don't know exactly what happened there. We don't know what deals were made under the table, potentially. We just see on face value on the news and through information we get. But we don't know what the Ukrainians and the Russians probably negotiated separately to this.
Yeah,
That's
because
correct,
wasn't there some under the table Saudi deal that they aren't disclosing exactly what it was of some Saudi billionaire? I could be completely wrong in that.
No, you're talking about the former Chelsea owner.
Right.
Who's a Russian, who was being put sanctions on in the UK, so he negotiated it. So we need to take in consideration that Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and the Russians and Ukrainians were involved in this deal. So there's a lot of high players there for their own agenda, trying to get these guys back out of the country.
And if you look at the diplomatic point of view, out of those 4 countries that Emile just mentioned, Ukraine is probably the weakest at that table. Where it comes to Turkey, has tried to be a mediator in the middle, but we all know Turkey is more pro-Russian, and Turkey has its interests with things like Armenia. So obviously the Turks would cut a deal potentially, or include something, hey, you pull back in Armenia, we'll help you, diplomatically in Ukraine. Ukraine may have been the weakest member at that table, but from what we're seeing, Ukraine definitely benefited probably the most out of this prisoner exchange.
Yeah, it seemed very funny with looking on those Russian Telegram groups it's just been hit after hit, because the people have seen that Kharkiv area has been liberated by the Ukrainians, and then Ukrainian high-level prisoners, especially Aiden has 120,000 followers or something on Instagram. He's the most well-known soldier, I guess, there, and people on that side absolutely despise him. To be released, it's almost sending a message from within of they're not taking it too seriously, almost. As far as on the Russian side,
I would agree, and I think, but it's very important to note what Emile said. I think there is definitely more to it than meets the eye. But yeah, it is sort of one after the other. These sort of big victories that the Russians recently had, things like Le Mans, Syria, stuff like that. It looks like very soon they're going to be reversed, as well as the Kharkiv region was won. Izum was a huge Russian fortress. I was relatively close to there at a few points, and you could understand there was huge Russian air superiority there, huge Russian build-up, and it was going to be the sort of cusp of the left flank or the northern flank coming down to capture Donbas. To lose that, and it looks like Le Mans is being encircled as we speak, so that will probably fall in the next day or two. And then, that's really, they're pushing rail hubs, and then that will be Severodonetsk, and the prisoners and everything. It's not a good way to start the motivation for a mobilization.
Yeah. Well, Oh, you go, Mil.
Sorry, but what we need to be mindful is that a lot of the news that we get is very different to the news that people in Russia get. So we see all this stuff because, like you're saying, it's our algorithms giving us that information because it's what we're supporting as such. But the Russians probably don't really see that 5 Brits, 2 Americans, a Moroccan and a Croatian was released. So to them, for some ethnic Russian who lives in the Federation over in Siberia doesn't really care because he's not exposed to that information. But I think, yeah, that mobilization, which we've all seen over the last few days, I've had a good old chuckle at some of the videos of drunken men going off. Obviously, it's a bit of a Russian tradition. The night before guys go off to the army, they generally have a party with the family and get drunk. But we're seeing low-level kind of guys who are supposed to be former veterans who've been rounded up and taken off to the army for this mobilization. And at the same time, we're seeing hundreds of thousands of men trying to leave Russia to go to safety. I've just been in Armenia. I just left Armenia a couple of days ago. I went there because Azerbaijan attacked once again. So I left straight from Ukraine to go there. The amount of Russian men hanging out in Yerevan in the bars and the hookah bars there to avoid conscription is massive. So there's a lot of people, we've seen the protests. They're not anti-war protests we're seeing, they're anti-conscription, going off mobilization protests. There's a difference. And we see what Putin's speech several months ago, he actually said mobilization will not happen, and he's reversed on that. And a lot of people see that as a weakness.
Yeah. And what is the breakdown of this mobilization? Because I'm seeing so many conflicting reports from 300,000 to 1 million, from veterans to men. Do you have any sort of more information on this?
I think Ryan could probably answer this better.
Yeah, best question for Ryan. You're more the OSINT guy then. I don't have the.
I mean, I can talk about the mobilization a little bit. I've heard stuff from 300,000 to 1.2 million. So, I mean, it's great. You can want to do that, but 300,000 soldiers means 600,000 pairs of boots. Let's just start with 300,000. Let's just start with the low end, right? So, typically when you're dealing with any kind of military procurement, you don't just necessarily have stuff in a warehouse. You have to contract and produce that stuff. So it means purchasing boots or building boots. Someone has to get a contract for those boots. Looks like, from what I understand, a lot of the production capacity for the Russian military is done in prisons. So I don't know how well you can scale that. So that means Russia is going to have to go outside of their normal supply channels in order to procure boots, uniforms, things like that. They can't necessarily go to China because I don't think China wants to touch Russia with a 10-foot pole right now. Russia is radioactive. They certainly backed the wrong horse, and they're embarrassed about that. So there is definitely a problem in trying to get feed and clothe and put boots on 300,000 people. It's not, people have said, oh, they're gonna rush them through a 2-week training program. Well, great. Now they have to house them. They have to find the facilities. They might have deactivated a lot of their basic training facilities. If the United States had to react, if we had to train up 300,000 people, we would have trouble doing it. So you can only imagine what's going on in Russia. Even stuff like coordinating transportation. You got to get people from the rifle range to the grenade range to the anti-tank range. You need to coordinate all the transportation for that. You got to get the buses. That isn't something that can happen overnight. So you can want to mobilize 300,000 people. You can want to mobilize 1.2 million people. And they might be trying to do that. And you might have people saying, oh, yeah, we're doing that, boss. But have you ever lied your way out of a problem? So I don't know how I'm going to have to take a look at this. I believe Russia has 29 basic training facilities. And usually their AIT, their advanced training is done either at the unit or at a specialized school. So and the other weird thing is Russia doesn't have light infantry. It's not like the US and the UK and Australia. Everything in Russia is mechanized. So if you're going to train people on how to fight in a mechanized environment, you need the physical equipment there. You need to maintain that equipment. You need to have the fuel for that equipment. It's going to be it's going to be tough for them to do all that.
Yeah, like Ryan is saying there is for example, when we were fighting Afghanistan and Iraq, on paper, you'd have X amount of troops in the battle. That's not how many men are actually physically fighting that battle, because logistics in order to get men to that front line with a bayonet on to charge against the enemy takes a lot of people in the background physically to get them from A to B. The mobilization of the war in February on the 24th, when the invasion first started for the Russians, was about 175,000 men.
Yeah.
When we went into Iraq, it was about 210, 215 roughly.
Yeah.
So about 175,000 from the Russians, about 30,000 from the Donetsk and Luhansk regions of the pro-Russian. So we're looking at about 200,000 men.
Yeah.
We've seen what 200,000 men can do for Russia. Not much, really, because they've been pushing back quite extensively recently. So to mobilize 300,000 more men into the battle, when sanctions are taking effect, supplies to go to Russia to build new equipment, which they've lost massive amounts, is going to take a long period of time. Yeah, we can see loads of men going for 2 weeks training, shooting on the range, but how long is it going to take them physically to be battle ready to go to the front line and fight? That's a very different story. So I don't really think immediately it's a massive threat to the Ukrainians, unless we're looking at a Stalingrad kind of style where they're just throwing men forward with limited weapons, limited rounds, and just going. We've seen lots of videos circulating actually of very old AK-47s being opened up and given to these guys. So yeah, like Ryan hit the nail on the head there about something as simple as boots.
I don't know how true the AK-47 thing is. People ask me about it. I know I saw rusty AKs. I know I saw that, but they were I believe AKMs or the old style AK. Yeah, they were AKMs.
Yeah.
Stamp receiver, the little the flash thing.
I'd interject on that, and I'd say just personal experience serving although Ukrainian army is quite modernized in some ways, I'd say it's about 50-50, 50% Soviet, 50% NATO. And just, poor admin are rife. But one of the personal thing that I experienced, so when we came back from I believe it was our first rotation from frontline, there was an ammo, I can say, whereabouts it was, because, we don't control that area anymore, but there was an ammo dump over in the Kherson region that our brigade used. And I remember we packed, so when you finished your frontline rotation, you would take all your ammo with you. You wouldn't just leave it there. Obviously, our battalion ammo was our battalion ammo. So we would load it back up and take it with us. Obviously, it's all old Soviet ammo. And then it would get stored in a warehouse that was damp, leaky roofs. It was just another old Soviet warehouse. I don't know if they were spare or what it was, but a lot of our AKs were also stored with this ammo. And I was I was leading part of a working party that was going to do inventory on the ammo and load it back up before we went on our second frontline rotation in Donbas in 2020, I believe. And those AKs have been sitting there for a few months, and they were covered in molds, they were covered in rust because they hadn't been, stored and oiled correctly. And I think it's the same thing that's going on now, and very similar to what Ryan said. But you can look at things like procurement and stuff like that. But one thing we forget, because we're from NATO, Western militaries that have evolved, the Russians haven't. So the Russians do have 600,000 of everything. Probably it's been stuffed in some warehouse in the east of Russia and the north of Russia, and it's been there since the fall of the Soviet Union. But they do have it. I've seen Soviet warehouses across the world in all different countries, and that stuff is there. Obviously, it's not serviceable and it's been there for a long time, but you could equip 600,000 troops. You just be equipping them with old AKMs, potentially Mosin, steel helmets, Soviet body armor, Soviet boots. So you could equip them, but are they equipped to the standard? And the answer is no, compared to the average Ukrainian soldier.
I have to drop because I have another meeting, but have the Russians used, it doesn't make sense to me that you'd be issuing 7.62 by 39. They have to have plenty of AK-74s, 5.45.
I would assume so as well. I assume so as well. But
my only guess is this is a training rifle. Like, here's your rifle, clean the crap out of it, train on it, and then we're going to give you the 5.45 when you go to war.
I think
that's why I was reluctant to talk about this, because you can't underestimate the Russian army, man.
Exactly. Yeah, you can't. This is a big problem. We've all three of us have discussed this as well, separately and in person. The whole orc propaganda and the this and that. It doesn't sit well, because it obviously you have to dehumanize the enemy, but at the same time you have to understand this army is still large, powerful, with a lot of heavy conventional weaponry. I think what it comes down to is potentially the training rifles, or the newer, because it was newer, 5.45 rifles are with active military units. whether they be in Russia, abroad, or Ukraine. And then what's in reserve is 7.62. And it's the same in Ukraine. They were handing out brand new 5.45 rifles that were in reserve, but then they had, below that was tons of 7.62 rifles that were out there. And what do they give to the DPR and LNR soldiers? They give them the crap. So they're going to get the lower stuff, and then the Russian army will get the better stuff, and then the mobilized guys will get the middle stuff. You don't see AK-12s anymore. You don't see AK-12s anymore because they're terrible, but that's another thing.
All right, I got to drop for another meeting. It's good talking to you guys.
Thank you,
You
mate.
too.
Really appreciate it.
Pleasure,
Absolutely.
Ryan. Thank you.
Thanks,
Take care, Ryan.
Oh, sorry, gentlemen. I had to link out for a little bit. Then I got a warning on my Zoom of like,
Yeah, I just had an upgrade. That's when you guys were talking about it. I had a dip out and I had to upgrade my Zoom. I paid about $13 for it. So it was about to cut us off.
You had to?
Yeah, we've had to pay 15. I had to pay 15 as well, mate.
Oh, you did as
well? I just paid.
Yeah, I'll refund you because I thought if I bought it, it would upgrade because I'm hosting the meeting. I apologize.
No, I think it's everyone's got a limit.
Really? Funny,
yeah,
Zoom,
but
Zoom.
I don't mind doing it. It's a useful thing to have, isn't it? If we're doing stuff like this.
Zoom
I
is
mind,
doing
but
the
I'll
boys
send you an
too.
invoice later.
That's right, mate. I'll deduct it off my expenses for you.
Yeah.
Labour fees.
Yeah, but it's a very interesting topic that don't underestimate Russia and the amount of equipment. I guess, John, you've got, or at least compared to me, so much more experience with that about just how much stuff they've got. Like, do you think that they will be able to? Because I guess the problem that you and me spoke about on an interview in the bunker, which went really well, was actually putting men in tanks. Like, it's all good to have 10,000 tanks, but you need 4 men, 3 men per one. Do you think this mobilization could see that actually becomes a reality?
Again, I've never had experience with tanks. I've been in a few of the old, the old tanks. They're incredibly cramped, uncomfortable. But I don't know tanks, but I'm sure you probably could get someone up to the ability to drive it and shoot the gun within 2 weeks and then throw them into the tank. Again, but that's a morale thing. You're already seeing. Imagine you rock up and then they're like, yeah, well, here's 2 weeks training and you're jumping on this train with your tank and going into Ukraine. You're going to have a lot of people running away, going, hey,
well, I was literally watching a video yesterday of a prisoner of war, Russian prisoner of war, who's just been mobilized the last few weeks. And he was a driver of a BTR, and the Ukrainians are talking to him. And he's like, yeah, I was given a little bit of training, learned how to drive it. I didn't know how to drive it. His whole team were killed. He survived and was taken as a prisoner. And he's like, I didn't want to go driving this vehicle. Of course, he's going to say that once he's captured. But yeah, so their training is very limited. I'm going to go against the popular grain and against what both you two agree, and a lot of people agree, is I don't believe the might of the Russian military is hyped as much as everyone makes out. There's no doubt they're a big army. There's no doubt they've got old, heavy equipment they can use there. But I think the whole Russian military is a myth. The strength of it is a myth. It's been shown on the battlefield in Ukraine. That people go, don't underestimate the Russian army. I'm underestimating the Russian army. They cannot take on Ukraine. They have struggled to take territory in Ukraine. The majority of territory you see on the map that's now colored red is just areas that have just evolved from the 2014 borders. The Russian military has been hyped up by NATO for so many years in order to have an enemy. If NATO doesn't have an enemy, people don't join NATO, people don't invest money into their arms. So NATO's hype of Russia's been going on since the Cold War. Also, Russia's hype, I think even Putin's been lied to for all these years, that he thought he had this superior military force. Of course, don't get me wrong, the Russians haven't deployed everything into the battle. Of course not. Same as when we were working in Iraq and Afghanistan. We didn't deploy everything into the battle, but we put enough into the battle to actually win it to a certain degree. Russia, who's been humiliated in the world, is losing influence all over the world, they need to do something about it. And the reality of it is the Russian military is a myth. Yes, strength in numbers and hard equipment, but I don't stand there when people go, oh, don't underestimate the Russians. I'm underestimating them because I've seen them on the battlefield and I've seen how poor they are effectively working on that battlefield against Ukraine, which is supported by NATO's weapons, not actually by NATO's physical presence. So a war between NATO and Russia, yeah. Well, Russia doesn't stand a chance. Sorry, let me just finish.
Yeah, go on.
And Putin knows this. He knows a war with NATO will be a disaster for him. He's got no real allies in the world other than North Korea, Iran to a certain degree, and Syria. So he knows he's really isolated, and NATO would smash Russia. And that's my opinion on this. And this is why we see the rhetoric of him constantly going on about the narrative of nuclear weapons, is because he knows he's got that in the arsenal. He knows that's his get out of jail card, going, don't mess with me because I've got nuclear weapons. So yeah, and that's why we're constantly hearing him talk about them.
That's an interesting point about the nuclear weapons, and I've not seen it discussed anywhere. Is if the Russian army is their equipment is so faulty, their operators are so, inept, their morale is so low, and we saw it many times in the Cold War. People were told to push the button, they didn't for whatever reason. There was accidents, mistakes, faults in the system. We know how much NATO's nuclear program is involved. Excuse me. Whether it be the British Trident program, whether it be the Americans' numerous programs, but then also the nuclear defense, the nuclear defense bubble. Is it even possible if Russia were to launch a nuclear weapons? I think the general consensus is they have so many, a few will get through. That could be the case. But even if they wanted to, are they capable of doing that? Are their nuclear, is their nuclear program good enough? Is their technological advancement good enough? Is it maintained well enough? Are the operators well enough? Are they willing? Because Putin could say push the button, but it's not Putin pressing the button. It's Putin giving an order that will echo through a chain of command, which will end up in the hands of a silo operator or a number of people. So let's look at the morale of the Russian army. Let's say we're going to push the button on 1,000 nukes, which come from, let's say, 400 different sites, 400 launching stations, whether they be air or whether they be ground or sea. Let's just say 50% attrition rate, just numbers out of the head because of the general Russian population, sort of disapproval of what's going on or the suffering that they're under, the suffering. How many of those nuclear weapons launch? Say half of them actually launch. Then how many of them get shot down? How many of them are faulty? How many of them don't go off? So is that even a play anymore? Because it's sort of that specter in the background, like nuclear weapons.
Yeah,
we know NATO's nuclear program is up to scratch, but we don't know the Russians.
Of course, we've just got to see what's happening on the battlefield with equipment to see that the Russian nuclear capability probably isn't maintained the way it should be. The issue you've got is launching from the ground or launching from a nuclear submarine. Is the chain of command is slightly different to a certain degree. And the fact is that people who, if he was to give the orders to push the button, guys on the ground know what's going on. They know they're reading the news to a certain degree. They're on Telegram. They know roughly what's going on. The danger is nuclear submarines where they're under the sea. They don't know what's going on in this battle. Their commanders and their chain of command is totally different than they would be on the ground. For example, that if they were given the order to code red, for example, launch it, they've been detracted from all the information. They don't really know how the battle's going on the front in Ukraine, that it could actually be a danger that someone in a nuclear submarine could launch. But clearly, as soon as that submarine rises up to open its tubes to launch, NATO are fully aware. And of course, missiles will be crossing each other. But I don't really think it's going to come to nuclear war at all. I think everyone knows the reality of a nuclear war is the end of civilization in certain parts of the world.
Well, that's the MAD treaty, the mutually assured destruction, is it only takes one to get through. And a lot of people don't understand how ICBMs actually work. Like, it's not one warhead. They go up into space, they break up into like 10 to 15 warheads. They've got different warheads that, act as like fake ones so that they'll try and distract systems. And the funny thing with the Russian might and power, and this is something I've only been thinking about recently, is Russia has pretty much the same GDP as Australia, but with 5 times the amount of people. And I look at, and with, of course, nowhere near the alliance Australia has with countries. And we would never think of the Australian military as any sort of superpower in any regard. But if you look at, actually, the GDP of the country is very similar. They're not as powerful as you think. America is 20 times or more the GDP of Russia. And it's where that military might, it just can't be what we sort of thought or what we were told is built up to be through our own propaganda as well, to justify spending $1 trillion a year amongst the different, like all the countries who are allied, I guess, in the West.
I think you can say
propaganda.
You could say that, like Emile said, obviously they're not as good as anyone. They do doubt them. They're not as good as they believe to be. But they do have the equipment and the manpower and stuff to keep up the war for longer, but so do the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians are much more motivated. You know, Ukrainians haven't even got to really general mobilization yet. They're not even at that stage, and they haven't announced it in response to Russians one, because I don't think they're that worried. I don't think they're that worried that mobilization is going to change anything for them, because of the victories that they're having, and because of the just reading, I've got it open now, just reading today the Ukraine General Staff announcement, which again, I understand it comes from the Ukrainian side, and I do, you know, look at the Russian side as well. So I'm not just speaking only from a Ukrainian point of view, but just looking at live UA maps, which is a very credible source. The Russians are still, you know, attempting assaults at this direction, over in the Donbas area, and they haven't advanced anywhere. And like Emile said, the Luhansk region, there wasn't any real massive fighting when the Russians, you know, took Luhansk Oblast, or when
even Kherson in the south.
Yeah, even in Kherson in the south. Well, when they took Kherson, when they took Zaporizhia Oblast, minus Zaporizhia itself, and when they took Luhansk Oblast, and it's been exposed now that it was traitors, and it was prearranged, and it was something that they've been planning for many, many years, and they had it, and it literally fell within the first couple of days. So they took those regions through, you know, betrayal, and through, you know, diplomatic savvy, and you know, pulling insider cards and a long build-up. They took those regions without a fight, but then the regions that they've had a fight over, they haven't been able to take. Really, the Russians have been losing the war since the fourth day. The fact that they couldn't take it within their allotted time slot, their frontline troops, their professional troops, like the VDV division that was around where I lived in Bucha, and the ones that tried to take Kiev, they're, regardless of if they're still active, which they are, they're active in Kherson region and some other places. Those guys, we're in month 6, 7 of the war. Like, those guys just can't just keep fighting, and they won't be able to. You have to rotate your soldiers out. So, what are the alternatives? And they're at a massive disadvantage in regards to, you know, we all three of us know this. It really does come down to the strength of the man on the ground. How many of them make up that composure?
Yeah. And don't get me wrong, when I say that the Russian military strength's a myth, of course there's some excellent Russian soldiers. Of course there is. There's no doubt there's some good battalions and good units out there fighting this war. But the whole point is the Russians' motive, well, the way they do their battles is still very Soviet in the sense of just bomb the shit out of it. Like we saw in Mariupol, it's very hard. For example, if we were to, when we took Basra and we took Baghdad, for example, we didn't just bomb the hell out of it constantly and then roll through the streets like the Russians do. We tried to minimize our damage as much as we can to a certain degree. The Russians, like we saw in Mariupol, is just raze it to the ground and then send your troops through. It's still an old way of fighting. So when it comes to artillery battles, the Russians are great at it. Bombardments, they've got bombs all day long. They can continue putting them down the tubes and firing them towards the Ukrainians. But actual street-to-street fighting, they are not as great as everyone thinks they are. When it comes to this mobilization, yeah, the HIMARS is a weapon that has massively changed the battles. Yeah. And what the HIMARS has done as well is given the Ukrainians a massive morale boost. It's everyone talks about the HIMARS and how great these weapons are at targeting. Clearly, we know that Ukraine isn't fighting alone. We know NATO is to provide them intelligence on locations to target and such. So yeah, it's been very effective. And like every Ukrainian says, we need more of them because it is actually, it's having that longer jab against your enemy that they can't really get in, and you can get further with your jab rather than coming in to protect now. So yeah, it's a massive advantage for the Ukrainians. But yeah,
the Russians had that.
These 300,000 men that are going to be thrown into the battle, it's just going to be a war of attrition. One of my friends is an Ukrainian soldier who was fighting in Kharkiv 2 months ago. I met him when he came back to Kiev. I went out for some lunch with him. And he said the Russians would be sending wave after wave after wave of men, like Dan was just mentioning there, to gain very little ground. That the first wave gets mowed down, they wait 20 minutes, the second wave gets up and starts advancing again. And it's just the manpower. And I fear that a lot of these 300,000 men, if they ever make it to the front lines, are just cannon fodder for the Russians.
Yeah.
Yeah,
it's an insane strategy in this day and age.
Yeah, it's how we think of World War I, of the trenches, climbing out of the trench and charging on the blow of a whistle. And you have to remember, a lot of these Ukrainian soldiers that fight at the moment have been fighting for 7 months. They're fighting for the homeland. They're battle ready to a certain degree. Of course, there's new guys coming into the battle, but as a force, they're battle ready. These men that have just been plucked off the street, who served in the army 15, 20 years ago and given a uniform again, off you go, they're not battle ready. This is what we're seeing in the Kherson region, that a lot of the troops in the Kherson region aren't battle ready, because at the beginning of the war, they very quickly took that region. So a lot of the battalions that are in that area, other than the ones that have been rotated out, haven't really seen combat experience in the last 7 months. And with the Ukrainian counter-offensive now going in, that they're having to reinforce from other positions to get more hardened troops. And that's why we've seen an increase in Chechens that have been turning up into the Kherson region.
Yeah, right. But do you think that there's any way that these mobilized guys are, I guess, they won't be going straight to the front line, that they will be, I guess, freeing up guys, like more professional soldiers, to go out to the front? So, you know, where they've got checkpoints, so they might have some full-time guys on the checkpoint, or just to free up that so you can have your more professional, like better soldiers going to the front. Because a lot of what I've seen is people talking about, and I'm not saying this is right or wrong, but saying that, you know, really the full-time Russian army professional soldiers aren't that involved currently. It's more the separatists, and there's more some reserves. We haven't actually seen a lot of those full-timers. Is there anything truthful?
No, there's definitely one of the reasons that the Kharkiv region folded so quickly, not only was it a great military offensive from the Ukrainians, but also the troops they left to guard that vanguard, the sort of up and left northwest of Izum, were LNR militia guys, you know, not very well equipped, not very well motivated. They folded in pretty quickly. Yeah, most of the action is being conducted by the regular Russian army. That's definitely not in dispute. From the casualties, the captures that we're seeing, the things that I've personally seen in the areas that I've been in. But it will face a big problem for the Russians. Again, we won't know until we see the actual figures, until we see the actual troops. But it does seem, and typical of Russia, they did it in the Soviets did it in World War II. The frontline troops, the cannon fodder, the Siberians, the sort of, you know, sub-Mongolian peoples, the Yakuts, the Buristanians, I think they're called Tuzus. Lots of these are things like Dagestanians as well. A lot of these people from the sort of ethnic minorities of Russia, the sort of outer lying federal republics, are being used. The issue with that is, and what we saw, and this isn't just my opinion as a you know, someone who's pro-Ukrainian, this is the evidence that came out of places like Bucha. It was things that I saw personally when I was working, and I was involved with some of the first units that entered liberated areas in the Sumy region after the Russians left. And I spoke to civilians, and they said that when the first Russians came through, everything was fine. They were focused on military objectives. And what I experienced as well when I evacuated from Bucha and I went through the Russians was those first line guys were professional, focused on military tasks. They were the tip of the spear. And then collaborated by, you know, people that I spoke to in the liberated areas. The first Russians that came through, no problems. They came through, they pushed through, they went in, they were fighting, they did their thing, they moved on. And then the problems would come with the sort of third line troops. They would be the ones stealing washing machines. They would be the ones looting, in some cases raping, committing these crimes because, you know, they're the rear troops. They're bored. They're undisciplined. They're normally the sort of shitbags of the military as well. So if you do that, if they send in this huge mobilization force, and, you know, for a lot of these ethnic minorities and these sort of what they call sub-Russian people, because the Russians don't respect them or care about them, they don't see them as equals, as Russians. These people, a lot of their motivation for coming to Ukraine is the ability to loot. You know, there was a lot of infighting in Mariupol between people like the Buristanians and the Chechens and the regular Russians, because they have like a loot scheme. I don't know officially how it works. It's an unofficial thing, but the Chechens are entitled to the most loot for some reason. That's you know, something that's officially revealed. The Chechens are entitled to the most loot, then the Russians and the Buristanians, and the sort of, you know, ethnic minorities. So you have this thing where a lot of those people are from incredibly poor, underdeveloped areas, and they have this sort of opportunity, go to Ukraine, earn a lot of money, steal what you want, take what you want. They see, you know, white Ukrainians or just ethnic Ukrainians as the sort of subhuman people. That's how they've been brainwashed. So if you take all these guys and put them in the rear, it'd be very detrimental for Russia, because these guys will be in the rear, bored, causing problems, getting more drunk, Stealing,
Yeah,
raping.
let me just jump in there quickly. Putin's speech the other day, when he talked about mobilization, he also talks about the criminal implications for deserting. That if you were to desert your unit or surrender, it's 10 years in prison. He also announced that if you're caught looting, it'd be 15 years in prison for looting. And then the fact is, imagine the Western military going to war or mobilizing more troops and going, by the way, if you get caught looting, you're going to prison for 15 years. You just wouldn't say it. It'd be said. It's just a no-brainer. You just don't do that. And like Dan is saying, and you've seen yourself, Willie, is a massive issue in Ukraine with the looting. When I was in Bucha, where Dan's from, actually, where he lives, after it was liberated, all the trenches were just full of alcohol. You're going in all the houses and they're just ripped apart. They're going through all the drawers looking for like cell phones, for money. All the alcohol was taken out of the houses, and I think it's very much that these rear echelon soldiers who are the sub-Russians as such from the east and for the ethnic regions just didn't have any regard whatsoever, that they just destroyed the place. And it is the first line of troops that did move up were the more disciplined, as you would expect in any war. But what was coming with the rear echelons was lots of war crimes. And especially in Bucha, I went to the headquarters where the Russians were, where they had literally left about 6 hours before, and there was men tied up with shot in the head. There's people in the basement who were just tied up and shot, and then a grenade thrown in. That they've got no regard for Ukrainian life at all, because these people are from lower class society as such, and the Russians have been to send them forward as cannon fodder.
Yeah, and I guess there's been the recent mass grave found again, just up in the Kharkiv region. I guess you might have more idea on that, John, than myself. There was one of the 400 bodies found in a recent mass grave, but the reporting on that has been just all over the place. From like they were buried, like the Russians buried Ukrainian soldiers and marked the graves, through like just execution stuff. It's been just all over the place. And I talked to a friend who was there, and he was like, "There's not that much evidence of like execution." Because I asked him, I'm like, "He's there?" And he's like, "Not really, not particularly," because he was helping exhume the bodies, but he was there a fair bit later than when they first started.
I wouldn't say I'm a subject matter. I did go up there, but it was a while after most of the bodies had been taken out, just out of an interest thing, because I was seeing the same thing, and we spoke about it before. But it's one of those things, and obviously Ukraine is there's a very clear line between good and evil in this war. Ukraine is obviously in the right, although they do have their problems, and Russia is obviously in the wrong, with very little good things to say about them. But it's very important how you portray people, because obviously you can cry wolf. Something like Bucha was very... One can fault me on this, but I was in Bucha. I stayed for the first 16 days of the war. I was trapped there. I was working as a medic. I saw what happened. I was there when the Russians captured it. Luckily, it wasn't found by them, and I managed to get out. And it's very important, like you say, like, again, it doesn't justify any of these things. These things aren't justifiable because of these reasons. But saying that innocent civilians had their hands tied behind their backs and executed, but then weeks later, the Ukrainians announced that a lot of the people that were killed in that way were territorial defense members, partisan fighters, and that's another legal thing which I'm not knowledgeable enough to speak on. But it's the same with the Izum thing, and the problem is you portray it, these heartfelt photos, and it is an informational war. You have to do these things, but you should be very honest. And you should be very clear. People state mass graves. People think of the Holocaust, hundreds of emancipated bodies stuffed into a hole and lazily buried, just complete disregard for their humanity. But, and I'm sure we're all soldiers. We've all done a bit of digging in our time. I'd happily say I've probably done the most digging in 2 years in a trench in Ukraine, but digging's hard. It's fucking hard.
Nothing to be proud of being able to dig.
It's nothing to be proud of. It's a monkey's job. But it's hard to dig. It's a fucking hard work. And to dig, I think there was maybe a few. I couldn't say for sure. I haven't looked at it individually, but it looked to me like they were all individual graves. So individually dug graves, individually marked. If they were military, they were marked with Zesil, with their name and Zesil, if they had their documents on them. So they were named graves, and they were also marked as civilians. Obviously, I would hazard to guess and say that more of those civilians were potentially killed in Ukrainian shelling, because the Russians took Izum and then they held Izum for a while, and obviously the Ukrainians were bombing Izum, and a lot of people stayed in Izum. So the fact that they, took the time to individually dig those graves, because you have to. It's not like they did it out of respect. You can't leave bodies lying around. You get disease. So they individually dug those graves.
So sorry. So the two differences: mass grave is terminology where you put loads of people in one hole. Mass burial is where you individually do it across a large space through a wood. So there's very different. In ISM, there's the two lots. There was the mass graves and there's mass burials of different people. Clearly, like you're saying there, the Russians had to get rid of the bodies and put them somewhere. Yeah, of course, some of them were probably killed by Ukrainian artillery and shelling that came into that region. We don't really know. And obviously there's an independent organization that's going, I don't know what the organization's called that's doing it, that does all the
war crimes
bodies. Yeah, the war crime trial.
Yeah.
So obviously it's a bit too early to tell there. But like you mentioned a minute ago, saying about the people in Bucha where they're partisans. So yeah, they had their hand tied by that. It's irrelevant if they're partisans or not. Under the rules of armed conflict, you cannot just go around executing people. It doesn't matter what you do. It doesn't matter what you if you're the top tier SF soldier, doesn't mean that you're entitled to get someone to put a bullet in your head. So it's still murder at the end of the day. What was going on in this region I'm not saying that the Russians have murdered and killed everyone on their way. Of course not. But there are lots of issues of war crimes that need to be addressed, and I think it's gonna these things take time. You think just a normal, if I was to go out on the street today and kill someone, I wouldn't probably go to trial for another 6 months to a year, because of how much evidence you would need for a simple murder in the street. So imagine how long it's going to take the process of these war crimes tribunal to look into that. And of course, there's war crimes that have taken place on both sides. There's no doubt of that. But clearly, and I say this all the time to people, the simple fact is, if Russia had not invaded Ukraine, this death and killing would not be going on. So when I argue with people who are very pro-Russian and they say, "Oh well, Ukrainians are killing people as well with their artillery," they wouldn't be launching their artillery if the Russians weren't in the sovereign territory of Ukraine. So people can sugarcoat it whatever they want. It's simple as Russia needs to go out of the Ukrainian borders and back to Russia.
I think there's a fair argument too, though, in that the individual responsibility, like if you commit a war crime, especially through the trial by media, is if you were to watch the mainstream narrative and mainstream media, the only ones committing a single war crime, a single act, are the Russians. Where only today that photo has come out of a Ukrainian soldier with his cooking stove boiling the head of a Russian soldier. And
I've seen this one.
Yeah, no, that is. I'll send it to you, Emile. But that is something that
Can't wait.
It's very easy to fake. He's wearing a Ukrainian military issued T-shirt. I have about 50 of them. You just get given them in the Ukrainian army. They're part of the Ukrainian army uniform. He's wearing a generic pair of pants that both I think British Army issued multicam pants. They might be Pixel, Ukrainian Pixel, and he's wearing trainers. And obviously, war dehumanizes people. It's potentially good. It's potentially that he did it. It is a Ukrainian soldier, but also it doesn't really make sense. And especially that the Ukrainians would try and choke that from getting released as much as possible, whereas the Russians could easily put it out there. I mean, very easily fake. It's pretty much like is a human head in there. Yeah. You've got enough dead bodies. Why would you need to fake a dead body? It probably is a human head in there. Is that Ukrainian soldier or not? We don't know. They will find out and identify that person, I'm sure, through the OSINT groups. But one thing I wanted to mention, based off what Emile said, was a strong point that I've put to people for a while. The reason we saw disproportionately more war crimes in places like Kiev region, Chernihiv region, Sumy region, is because those places are considered ethnically Ukrainian. They're not really places that Russia want. Russia want their Novorossiya concept, which is Odessa, linking Transnistria all the way, Crimea, Kherson, Zaporizhia. But they don't really want. It's not like they want Kiev and all those other regions to become part of Russia. So when the Russians invaded, with a lot of brainwashing as well, those people are like, they're ethnically Ukrainian. They're not linked to Russia. They're bad Nazi fascist people. And then there was also a lot of spite. Like they got there and they're like, oh, fuck, this is how these people live. I live in a village in the east of Russia, or I live in, poor, not everyone does in Russia, but I live in poorer conditions or in more Soviet conditions. And then next thing you know, you're in Bucha, which is, is an incredibly beautiful place. And there's things like Nutella and washing machines. And there was a lot of spite there. But then what we'll see is when the Russians capture places in the east, and if they do continue to capture more, is those Russians, they're not capturing and controlling that territory or conquering that territory. in their minds, they're liberating those people. Those people in their minds are ethnically Russian. A lot of those people do consider themselves ethnically Russian. So when you get to those places, they're not going to go there and say, "Oh, you dirty Ukrainian fascists." They're going to go, "Hello, brother. We're here to free you. You Russian people." So you're going to see a lot less war crimes being committed in the east of Ukraine, and you'll see a lot more pro-Russian people in the east of Ukraine than you would if this war was being conducted in the west of Ukraine.
Yeah. But more my point is there is undoubtedly been war crimes committed on both sides. And undoubtedly, you're correct, Emile, that none of this would have happened if Russia chose not to invade. But more my point is I believe the individuals need to be held responsible for, if they have committed a crime, they are held responsible. And I don't care what side, if you're Ukrainian or Russian, if you've committed a blatant war crime, they should be held accountable for it. But I just think the media narrative that would never give traction to crimes that have happened on the other because it doesn't suit how the reporting works.
No, 100%. And like it was mentioned earlier, and I say several times, wars aren't just fought on the battlefield, they're fought in the information space. It's all about the bigger picture. Is that the narrative is very much that the West support this Ukrainian side. Same as the war in Syria. Very much the narrative was to support the Free Syrian Army, the terrorists against Assad and the Russians. Is the media does pick a side? Of course it does, because governments pick a side, and the media generally follow that suit with that. So yeah, of course. Even like you mentioned earlier about live maps, UA. When you look at live maps, and there's a great source for seeing what's going on, you see where the Russians have attacked and where the Russians are bombed, and we don't ever see where the Ukrainians are bombed. And we know ourselves, some people in Ukraine that go around and run around and drive around the country, very naive, that they think, oh, there's a red line on the map. It says on live maps, it means that anything past that red line is Russian, and on the other side is Ukrainian. It doesn't work that way, because it is a one-sided app. For example, it is only giving you the Russian side and not the Ukrainian side, so there's a lot of information that's getting lost. But yeah, definitely, you're totally right. If war crimes should be called out on both sides, 100%. People in the Ukrainian side.
The problem is with that, though, like Emile's saying, and I think we're all aware of this and we all agree on this, and we saw it, even though the Amnesty International thing was just them talking out their arse and just being, for whatever political reasons that they posted that report. But it's one of those things where even if you did have a Ukrainian, and there has been, nowhere near as many Russian accounts, obviously, because Russian are the aggressor and they're, disproportionately destroying, peaceful territory. But obviously there is Ukrainians doing things as well. There has been Ukrainians who have done things. Some of it's been proven to be fake, like the leg shooting video. But the issue is, if say, Sky News came out tonight after posting, months and months and months of pro-Ukrainian, or not pro-Ukrainian, but, focused on Ukraine's victories. If someone was to come out and say, we've recently acquired footage, or we've done an investigation into these Russian prisoners of war that were executed by Ukrainians, we have video footage, people wouldn't go, great, well done for exposing, well done for being non-biased and being equal. They would be crucified, because it's a mob mentality war. And this is why you've got, I wouldn't say a lot, but obviously if you follow any Russian things, these pro-Russian Westerners, and these, a lot of Americans who think they're suffering because of the war in Ukraine and we shouldn't help Ukraine, and et cetera, et cetera.
Taxpayer money.
Taxpayer money, my taxpayer, I think it works out something like 1/4 cent comes out to go to Ukraine for that. Anyway, but I think what a lot of it comes down to is that mob mentality. So the mob mentality in the West is obviously pro-Ukrainian. And then people like to go against the mob. Everyone likes to be different. There's those people that just want to be different. So if everyone's saying, Slava Ukraina, if everyone's saying, send help to Ukraine, help Ukraine, Ukraine's, fighting the good fight, which they are. There's no doubt about that, whether you're pro-Russian or pro-Ukrainian. You'd have to be, sort of quite dim to believe that Russia are doing a good thing. That those people would be, I just want to be different. There's probably a lot of the culture in the West about, the wokeness and the certain things. A lot of those people don't really think they're a woman in a man's body, or they don't really think they're this and that. They just want to be different because it makes them feel a bit, special. It makes them feel like they're not the same as everyone else. It's just like one of those things. I think, how can you be pro-Russian living in your house in America? After.
Yeah, I get it. One of the arguments that really grinds on me, and I was involved in the invasion of Iraq in 2003 as a young Marine, is when people go, well, the West invades countries, Russia can invade countries too. And it's like, I fought in that war. Now, in hindsight, as a soldier, you do your job. So any Russian soldier that is fighting the war, I'm not going to discredit. He's doing his service to his country. He's told to do it as a soldier. Yeah, he can surrender if he wants to surrender. That's his own prerogative. But a soldier does the duty of what the government sends them to do. And we've done that in Iraq as well. I now see the war in Iraq as we should 100% not have gone into Iraq. Obviously, I spent a long time in the Middle East post invasion as well with all my filming and stuff. And I've seen the damage we've done to that region. That argument of going, well, Bush and Blair have invaded Iraq, Putin can invade Ukraine, or how can we call him out on it, is because it's a very different world we live in now. Bush and Blair should be stood in war crimes tribunal in The Hague, as well as Putin. They are all criminals, war criminals, in my opinion, who've sent men to their death, killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. So there's no question. You don't compare yourself to the worst. You compare yourself to the best. You can't go, oh, well, that person was raped the other day, so it's okay for me to go out and rape someone. No, it's not. It's a straw man argument that people try to justify to go, well, yeah, the invasion should be allowed. I support Putin because everyone else has been invading countries for years. No, everyone should call it out when it's totally wrong, 100% wrong. Yep. And what's going on in this war is totally wrong. And like you're saying there a minute ago, is a lot of people that do comment about supporting Putin. Obviously, my followers online is predominantly American and British, for example. But there's a lot of Americans that support Putin. I'm like, what? You are living in the wrong country. Totally, you're lost in your ideas here. And also, there's a lot of military men that I served with who will say Putin's right invading Ukraine because they're Nazis. They're all Nazis, and there's so much corruption there. And it's like anything. Like we saw during COVID, everyone became a COVID expert overnight. Every Karen was a COVID expert about what was going on. When it comes to geopolitics, people are very much the same. They turn into this Karen who think they know everything about what's going on. And I think people just stick to their lanes.
People formulate their opinions off one piece of information they consume.
People love a conspiracy. People love a conspiracy. Like you were saying a minute ago, people want to go against the mass, go against the grain, go, I know something that you don't, and you're stupid for believing it. 9/11 was an inside job, and I know why, because the third tower, why did that fall? Prove to me otherwise. It's like, I don't need to prove a negative to you. Like, I was having an argument this morning with someone about the Queen owning a mine in Armenia. They said the Queen owns a mine in Armenia. I was like, show me the evidence that the royal family owns this mine. And she turned around to me and goes, no, you show me the evidence they don't. I'm like, what? How do I
you do the work for my argument. Yeah.
How do I prove a negative? You're making a claim. Show the evidence to back your claim up.
The people, and I think there's something. Me and Emile obviously spent a lot of time in Syria, and Emile's got Syrian family himself, and it's one of those things where I spent a long time in Syria and saw a lot of different sides of the conflict, and obviously I might get some flack for saying this, but although it was relatively brutal, but definitely nowhere near as brutal as like the invasion of Iraq or Afghanistan. But the Russian support for Assad and putting down that incredibly fractured country, and I saw it in my own eyes. You can sit there from behind your computer and disagree with me, but Syria has just had a war for too long, and it is a sovereign state, regardless if you like Assad or not. We shouldn't be just topping out. We topped out Saddam. That was a mess. We topped out Gaddafi. That was an even worse mess. And then we tried to topple out Assad. And then the Russians went, hang on a minute, no, you're not toppling out, another government. We're going to come in and support this guy through, a series of victories. And Syria is quite stable now. It has a lot of problems, and Assad might not be the best ruler in the world, but who is? Are we going to say that Biden or Trump is any better than someone like Assad? They've all got their own flaws and cons and pros. But for us to sit on a pedestal and say we can do this, but you can't do this, it really is a chance-to-chance basis. And a lot of people bring up things like corruption in Ukraine and stuff like that. Well, the whole Eastern Bloc, I forget the word for it. There's a certain word for the de-Sovietization of those countries after the Soviet Union collapsed. And they all suffer with corruption, but it's just more. People think of fat Slavic men in leather coats, handing off rubles to each other and stuff like that as Eastern corruption, but it's business level corruption, business and political level corruption, which is hugely rife, especially in America. You look at like Nancy Pelosi, who is, been, I don't know why people aren't in the streets, turfing them out, but, exposed multiple times that she does insider trading. You see her, what she invests in, and then next day she'll sign a bill supporting what she invested in. So that is corruption, whether it be done, tactfully or in an Eastern European style way. these countries suffer with corruption. So people use that as a justification. Ukraine's corrupt, and where's all our money going? I'll tell you where the money's going. The money's going to, put Russia down, which has been our eternal enemy since 1945, since we met in Berlin. It's been our eternal enemy. And for the first time since 1945, we can now look at our big, bad Russian red bear enemy across the pond, and we can say, you're fucking nothing. You are nothing up to the standard that we're at technologically, socially, culturally. And Ukraine has made that evident. If Russia didn't invade Ukraine, we would have carried on in the stalemate, carried on with this thing. Russia are big, scary, and evil. And all that we know now is Russia are evil, not big and scary. And Ukraine
They're not evil. Russia is not evil. What we're saying is Putin's has just made a bad mistake here, and he's pushing.
It's not just Putin. It's not.
Of course, it's more. There's more people in the Kremlin. But one thing I'm going to have to shoot in a bit anyway. But one thing I would like to say, Willie, because obviously I read some of your comments on some of your other YouTube videos. When people because people probably watch this interview and go, you're all pro Ukraine. You're all from one side. Why are you only telling one side? And really, you've got to be a bit of an idiot to ask that question. Why don't we go to Russia? Why don't you go to Russia and report?
Willie tried.
Willie tried to go, and then people said that you lied about trying to do it. People trying to call you out for that.
Yeah, I think he lied.
You're Australian, we're British. The sanctions on Russia, you can't go from one side of a war to another. Like my previous documentary was on the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan. I went to film from the Armenians' perspective. I then couldn't jump over to Azerbaijan because I'm a journalist. They don't look at it like that. They go, you're a spy or you're an enemy. You're telling stories from one point of view. From the media perspective, we tell stories. I'll go tell anyone's story. I'll go hang out with ISIS, the Taliban, anything. It doesn't mean I'm their friend. I'm just telling their story. I'm giving them a platform to voice their opinion. But when it comes to this war, we can't go to the Russian side. We can't just go, oh, see you later, Ukraine. We're jumping on a flight and go to Moscow. Because
British YouTuber just did. He just border bankrupt. He spends a lot of time. I think he's got family. I think his fiance's in Ukraine. He spends a lot of time in Ukraine. He does a lot of Soviet stuff. He's a very interesting YouTuber. He went to Russia. He obviously, he's naturally pro-Ukrainian. He loves the Soviet stuff. He loves Soviet culture and architecture and all that. But he, rightly so, just made obvious observations on the war. And then whether it was stupid or not, I don't follow him as much as I used to. But
when did he go to Russia though?
Literally, when a few weeks ago, he got arrested. He was set. It looked like he was going to get a long time in prison. The FSB, the Russian FSB, recently just released the recording of his interview. He done a fantastic job. He speaks really good Russian, and he just basically fed them what they wanted to hear. I don't support the war in Ukraine. They're all fascists. They're all Nazis. Just to get out, and he got out luckily. But he did go there, and he was, critical of it, whether he was trying to do that to highlight what can happen. And they arrested him. They were going to sentence him. It looked like he was pretty fucked. And then for whatever reason, he had an interview. He convinced them he wasn't pro. The Russians released it. You can look at it on YouTube. He sat there and he talked. He talked out his ass. He said everything they wanted to hear.
But the difference I'll say on that is that he probably had a Russian visa to get through airport customs to start with.
Yeah.
We would turn up at an airport, go show our passports, and they go, "Where's your visa? You're not even coming in." Let alone get to that stage to be arrested on the other side. So when people so when people start going on about, oh, well, you're biased because you're not telling the other story, there's other people on that side who are telling their story. And if you want to see an objective to a certain degree viewpoint, follow different people. You haven't just got to expect one person to tell the news of everywhere, especially when it comes to people that are independent.
Can you name one person on the Russian side? Any, these combat journalists they have where they're basically just militants. They wear military uniform.
I know. I'm not going to name any of their names, but
I'm not going to name any of their names. They're a bunch of fucking idiots. But some of them interviewed. You've got people. One name I will mention because people should know about it. People should read about him. How he was a paedophile sex blogger before and a war criminal now, and he's also sanctioned. Is Graham Phillips, who obviously interviewed Aiden and Shaun once they were captured. And he's a typical Russian puppet. Was plied with young women, and he was a sex blogger before in Ukraine before 2014. Those people, that's the caliber of people you've got to follow. And there is others, you know the names, Emile, but there is others, but they are pro-Russian. They're not to the point where they're like, oh, then maybe, people can say that we're linked to the British or Australian governments or whatever. But those people are openly linked for state-sponsored media. Yeah. Because we don't really have much officially state-sponsored media in the UK or the US or Australia. So those people, the people that you can go follow, you can't really verify things that they're saying because they are state-sponsored media. They are told what to say. Whereas we're not. Nobody's fucking telling us what to say. So we can go out there and we can say things that probably some Ukrainians won't like, what some of the things that we've said. But
well,
we will try and tell
that I put when I tried to fight my accreditation in the DPR, because the DPR on their website has like media accreditation. Okay, cool, fill it out, do my visa, do it all. And when they came back, with no, I chased it up, and they came back with no. I literally wrote back, like, if what you're saying about Ukrainians is true, then you have to let people see it. Like, if they are Nazis and they're executing these people and this and this and this, you would be like, we want Willie to come here and show this, because I don't have.
But because they're probably, and again, this is something, something if Ryan was still here, better to answer on. But there are a lot of these attacks, and there probably is Ukrainian shelling internets, and
of course there is.
But they should. But they won't let people in because they control the entire flow of their media. All their media is state regulated, and it's regulated literally by law. You say something they don't want you to say, they're fucking arrest you and put you in prison. But whereas Ukrainians aren't held by that, because there has been reports of Western media have exposed Ukrainian war crimes during this war, and the Ukrainians are held accountable to that. So if Ukrainians can't just go around and do what they want, whereas the Russians kind of can, because the information coming from their side is controlled by their side, whereas the information in Ukraine is predominantly, I don't really watch Ukrainian news. Nobody in the West does. We watch Western news, and you know how fickle they can be. If Ukraine makes some big mistakes or do some crazy shit, the Western media will turn on them. Ukraine is held accountable by outside media, whereas the Russians aren't.
Nowhere near the degree that the Russians held to it, though. And being a journalist in Ukraine myself, it isn't that free media sense, though. That there is, you're still under an accreditation issued by the military, and you still can't go to these places.
Of course.
You can't talk to these people. And
that's a lot of operational security stuff, though.
There's a lot of OPSEC, but then there's a lot of don't film this, don't film that. And
it's a lot of bullshit.
There's a lot of bullshit, and there's a lot of groups working within Ukraine. Because the biggest thing that annoys me about, and I believe in freedom and democracy and the ability to fight for that, so I fall under the umbrella of being pro-Ukrainian. But I hate the thing that you can't be critical of the side. Like, I've been in Afghanistan, and I believe in the mission that we did there. But at the same time, I believe you can be critical of anyone's actions for anything. And I am 100% critical of things that Ukraine has done at individual events. I'm not saying I'm critical of the entire conflict on one side.
Who does it benefit for you to criticise that? At this point in time,
but
in the future,
but if I do a video on that, imagine I did a video on, look, when I was in this area, there was a Russian body treated like this. And I'm critical of, these Ukrainians obviously treated this soldier incorrectly. That it's seen as you can't be critical of that side. And it's like, well, no. And maybe that's just my experience with it. But to say that, maybe you shouldn't be doing X, Y, Z, it doesn't mean that your whole thing is revolved around that. But I think that there is definitely some level of control around being critical of it, whether it is from the accreditations and people getting kicked out of the country for being journalists, through to some groups working there, some intelligence services, and as well as the public just don't want to hear it. The public do not.
Because you're there to give the information people want to hear, and people don't want to hear that at the moment.
But the thing is,
I
don't want to hear it. It might be hard to hear, but if it's true, it's true.
Yeah, no, but I totally get what you're saying, Willie, and I've experienced this in every country I've been to filming for the last 8 years now. Is that you want to tell the story, you want to see something, you want to report it, you want to tell the story. It doesn't matter, because we don't have a allegiance to a side. Of course, 100%. Anyone who's listening to this will go, Emile, you're pro-Ukraine. I am pro-Ukraine because I don't support Russia's invasion. However, I'm not Ukrainian. I will still call something out if I see it as wrong. But like you're saying, Willie, is that when you work in the media, you do need to be careful sometimes, because if you say something that goes against their narrative or what they're trying to write, is that you could get thrown out of a country, for example. But it's the same as, imagine a journalist with us when we're serving in the military in Afghanistan. Imagine a journalist coming out with us on patrol, and he's reporting on things that you don't really want him to report on, because it's like, well, that's going to discredit us. You're going to be like, you're not coming on patrol with me anymore. So I get the limitation. I totally get where they go, well, you're not signing up to our agenda, even though it's not an agenda as such, but you're not towing the party line, so we're not going to give you the access to tell any stories. And yeah, it is a murky water, it's a grey space, but that's what happens in time of war, is that people do go. You think about every single person that goes to a country that they're not a passport holder of, you are there as a guest. At any time, you could be asked to leave that country because your visa or whatever, they go, we don't want you in this country anymore. So really, as a journalist, it is hard sometimes to play the objective game because there are limitations put on you. But in Ukraine, you know yourself, if we went and we reported on something that Ukrainian soldiers have done, chances are we're not going to get thrown out of the country for doing it. If we were doing it constantly and consistently, and that's what the only thing that we were looking forward to do and report on, they would be like, hold on a second, what is your agenda? What
properly pro-Russian,
yeah.
It comes down to a lot of things as well. I think that people will, at this, again, and this is going to, I won't fault this, it's definitely a pro-Ukrainian stance, but obviously, if you were to release certain things like that at the moment, and obviously I'm 100% like, if Ukrainian commits like a blatant war crime, executing a prisoner or something like that, hell yeah, like put it out there. Obviously, it doesn't serve Ukrainians very well, but that shouldn't have happened. That shouldn't have happened. And this is why my organization, one of the main things that we cover is prisoner handling under the guidelines of the Geneva Convention. Is because if something like that happens, it should be made aware, you know, this is wrong, because you should be held to a higher standard. You know, we try and hold ourselves to a higher standard in Ukraine. But at the same time, you know, if it's something, you know, it's more of a propaganda-y thing or another thing, you know, a Ukrainian soldier, you know, kicked a dead Russian's body. I don't understand that. Ukrainian soldier has probably lost a lot of friends, has lost his home, his country's been invaded, his life was changed, his life was destroyed by this war. So is it really end of the world if he kicks a dead body a couple of times? And if you put that out there, that really only feeds pro-Russian propaganda.
And of course, and then like you're saying there, sorry to interrupt, but everything we do is going to be assessed by someone and looked at. Is that even this interview, this has been going on for an hour and a bit now, for example, is that we could take a segment of this, of like 10 seconds, 20 seconds, or even a minute of the segment of this whole hour and a half and discredit everything we've said. That we could change the whole narrative of what we've been talking about in a short period of time. Or for example, a video clip. There's a video clip and someone takes a screenshot from a video clip and that's all they show. It's manipulation of information. And throughout what we do and what we see in all wars, there's a massive manipulation of information. Even down yourself with TDI, when you were training the Ukrainians recently on the shooting range, and you go to me, oh, do you want to fire the guns? Do you want to test fire? And I was like, no, since I left the military, I haven't picked up a weapon since. And it's because in my head, as a filmmaker working in the media space, that one guy takes a picture of me with a weapon in my hand with the word press. Everyone's like, the Russians would use that against me and go, this is a guy who's reporting on Ukraine, he's supposed to be objective, but here's a picture of him with a weapon. Like Graham Phillips, we've seen there's several pictures of him floating around holding a weapon. So you have to conduct yourself in a certain way that, as Willie knows himself, is that we're always watching and thinking, how are we perceived? What do we say here? How is that going to be perceived by someone? Or what's going to be the comebacks or the fallout of that? So it is a minefield for the media trying to get it right, because you want to tell the correct story, but sometimes your hands can be tied.
It's a never-ending argument as well. And obviously, I think we're all you know, grown adults to the point where, you know, don't get involved in the comment section. The comment section is very toxic. I saw some comments on our video, our interview, Willie, and I've seen obviously a lot of stuff. Yours is very fiery, Emile, and I get it. I you know, I just block people. I don't interact with them, but I got some today. You know, it's the people that are big thing, and I think Aiden and Shaun were accused of it, you know, shelling innocent civilians in Donbas. And I could sit here, hand on my heart, the people watching, they don't know me. They don't know. I get called a MI6 agent, a foreign mercenary, and all these sort of things. I wish I was, because I'd be getting a lot more money, but nobody's asked me to be one yet. But yeah, the people come out and they say, you know, well, the Ukrainians have been shelling innocent civilians in the Donbas for, you know, 8 years. And they accused Aiden and Shaun of doing this. Well, we were in Pavlopol in Mariupol. There was, you know, I had a rifle and a grenade launcher, and the separatists were, you know, 200 meters away from me. I wasn't capable, even if I, you know, wanted to, which nobody would, to kill innocent people in the Donbas. And it's a big thing I see online, especially lately. It's the pro-Russian Westerners cop out. The Ukrainians have been killing innocent civilians in Donbas for 8 years, but they haven't. there is very, very little evidence, and there is tons of not only video and photographic evidence, but report evidence from missions like the OCSE, who were in Ukraine for the whole of the previous, phase of the war, and that there was disproportionately larger amounts. Obviously, there's always mistakes in war and always things that go wrong and go right. But the separatists were shelling from civilian areas, were using civilian shield, because they're a full state of sort of mafia, very mafioso, Eastern European Soviet state. And then people to say, oh, the Ukrainians have been doing this for this amount of years. Well, they haven't. They really haven't. And at the end of the day, that is sovereign Ukrainian territory. Nobody recognizes it, and literally nobody. The Russians don't recognize it because the separatists have been begging to be allowed into Russia for the last 8 years. And the Russians don't want them. They don't want this sort of pseudo, mafia republics to join the Russian territory. And I know from Russians, and I know from people that live in the separatist area, that when these people go to the Russian Federation with their separatist passports or even their Russian passports, the ethnic Russians hate them. They disrespect them. They treat them like garbage because they don't see them as Russians as well. They see them as these sort of, puppet state, idiots. So they're not respected by their own people. And this is another thing I think we'll see, that, I don't think they've been trying for 8 years, even with this invasion, justifying it by that. The Russians still haven't included them into their territory. And they went to war with the justification that they would help the DPR and the LPR expand their borders, not integrate them into Russia and expand Russia's borders, but expand the separatist state borders. So they don't want them in Russia. Nobody wants them. And they'll realize that soon. And I think the end outcome, whether it be 10 years, 20 years, 30 years in the future, that those states will come back to Ukraine if Russia won't take them, which I don't think they will.
Yeah. That said, I agree that there's no justification for this war, and there's no justification for most wars. But there is 100% evidence of that there has been Ukrainians in built-up areas that have put civilians in those areas in danger. And my whole bit that annoys me about how people perceive it, how the media does it, is I believe that people need to be held to the same standard. And I don't care, maybe I'm trying to be too objective, but I'm like, hang on, say with the Amnesty International article. Now, a lot of that stuff in it was true, but without context. When they say these soldiers are in a school, they were in a school, but there's hardly year 3 bloody classes running at the school. They're in a building that was a school. But at the same time, I've been to places in the Donbas before the war and walked around civilian areas, and there are soldiers and military positions within those areas. And my whole bit is I just hate the double standard of that. No matter what happens on one side is evil, and no matter what happens on one side is pure bliss, fantastic, great. I'm like, no, on a country scale, on a collective scale, we look at, Ukrainian is in the right, Russia is in the wrong, collectively. I think everyone can agree on this, or most people.
But from a soldier's...
What annoys me is the individual stuff where you said, if a Ukrainian soldier kicks a Russian soldier, online will be celebrated. Yeah, fuck that orc. But if it was vice versa, it would be the most disgusting thing that ever happened. And my whole bit is I believe in a lot of individual responsibility for things. And I believe we are holding one side to account and one not.
But a Ukrainian soldier should be in Ukraine. A Russian soldier shouldn't.
I agree.
And it's the same with the Amnesty International thing that they didn't highlight, which pissed me off, was because over the first few months of the war, Kharkiv city was surrounded. Sumy city was partially surrounded. Sumy was surrounded. Kiev was surrounded partially. Chernihiv was almost completely surrounded. Okay, if you surrounded in a city, where else do you fire artillery in front of?
But that's where they never gave context.
Impossible.
That's
they never gave context for, exactly. If you're in a surrounded city, where do you fire from? And the same with the buildings. A school, how a school is architecturally built, is built to house X number of people, a large amount of people in open spaces. Perfect conditions for a military.
It's simple as in Iraq and Afghanistan, our patrol bases were more often than not in and around civilian houses. That's where our bases were. Our patrol bases were in and amongst the population, and we were fighting from them positions. But I totally get what you're saying, Willie. I saw it in Kharkiv, is where military units move into residential areas, fire their rockets, and move out that area again. I totally get it, and that we know that goes on. But Dan, as well, you've got a correct point. Also saying when your back's against the wall, when you're invading your country, where do you actually find the weapons from? And of course, you need to take into consideration the civilians that are around you, but so does the enemy. Like when we were fighting in Afghanistan, we always took that in consideration, going, okay, we've got a target at SF-104. We know there's civilians in that area. Maybe we're not going to engage. We know both sides are using this. We can't turn around and say that Ukrainians are using civilians as human shields. We know that they're not as such. They are just fighting in and amongst the population sometimes.
But you also can't
guys, I
say
really
that,
do need to
sorry,
go.
mate. Oh, no,
Yeah,
thank
go
you,
on,
mate.
mate. Yeah, pleasure having you.
Are you guys carrying on without me?
Yeah, well, we've got a few.
Yeah,
more
we'll get two
things.
experts involved together now. We'll sort of cut the fat a little bit.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. More airtime, but great chatting. I look forward to reading all the comments from the crazy people who are on about conspiracies and all this stuff. Yeah,
it'd be great.
Yeah.
You're MI6, Willie's CIA, and I'm, I don't know, something else.
Apparently so.
MI9, yeah.
MI12.
Right. Catch you later.
Okay, thanks, mate.
See you later, 00.
See you in a bit. Bye-bye.
Yeah, it's just such a difficult one, man, to do with like where does personal responsibility lie, start and end. And I think one of my problems may be coming from, and I know you've had a lot more experience in this than myself, but I come from a professional military and I hold soldiers to a high standard of individual responsibility within this. And I find it difficult that I find it difficult when it is celebrated to commit war crimes on the Ukrainian side. And people will call me pro-Russian for this, and a lot of people blow up that I'm, you're a pro-Russian, and I'm like, well, I've spent more time in Ukraine than 99% of people
on the Ukrainian side.
On the Ukrainian side, and have many Ukrainian friends, and am trusted to go with Ukrainian position. It's just a ridiculous claim. But I believe you can still be objectively critical. And if I go, I think it's disgusting to celebrate, if true, cooking a Russian's head. I think. I think it's disgusting.
I don't think that's probably not the best. It's not the best point to highlight because it's very early days. I've only just seen it. But it's one of those images you can look at and you can easily say that's Ukrainian soldier because he's wearing a Ukrainian football t-shirt. But as we've seen with lots of the like pictures of Ukrainian soldiers that have been killed that the Russians have released, which I have to say most of them are like decomposing bodies, which shows the Russians are advancing very slowly, but almost exclusively, almost all of them, even the decomposing bodies, their boots have been removed. Always their boots. You'll see a lot of pictures of Russian soldiers in Ukrainian boots because we make good boots. We give our soldiers good equipment. And you'll see a lot of Russian soldiers in things like Ukrainian body armor, again, because it's good equipment. The Russian equipment is very poor quality. So it's very easy. Like they've captured huge amounts of Ukrainian territory and military bases. Like a lot of the military bases I served on have been captured. And in those bases will be tons of Ukrainian football t-shirts and stuff like that. So it's one of those things where it's like, why would the winning side do things like that? And one thing is it's quite different, but it's the same standard. And it's a personal opinion, but it's supported by overwhelming evidence. Assad and the gas attacks. Okay, almost every gas attack that Assad carried out was at the end of a battle when victory was certain. Like when the last remnants of the Free Syrian Army were being kicked out of an area, Assad would gas innocent civilians, and the white helmets would be present. And it's a long story, but it was very clear. And speaking to Syrians pro-Assad and not pro-Assad, they all told me, they all laughed in my face when I asked them about it for Syria. They all said it's obviously not true. And it's the same goes for this. Ukraine is obviously winning at the moment, or in the grander picture. They've just liberated Kharkiv region. Kherson's on the cusp of being liberated. A lot of it. So at that point, why would they do that? And let's say, for instance, let's put yourselves in that position. We're 2 Ukrainian soldiers in a position. We've, killed some Russians or whatever. We're not going to, probably, let's look at just from being, me and you are 2 soldiers, which we are. So let's say we've captured a Russian position, or we've killed some Russians, we've got a dead body, okay? Are you going to then, you're probably going to occupy that position, or are you going to move forward? Most likely they're going to move forward. They're not going to stay in that position. You're going to then behead that guy. And I've never personally beheaded anyone, but, we've seen plenty of videos of ISIS doing it. It's quite a laborious task to behead someone. It's quite a gruesome task to behead someone. So you're going to go through the process of beheading someone, cutting their head off, making a fire, putting it in a pot to get a picture posing with it. Like, there is, if you're a Ukrainian soldier, what benefit does that give you? It'd be easier logistically and for effort as well for you just to pose like this with the dead Russian soldier, which is absolutely fine. You're celebrating your kill. You know, you're a soldier that's captured or killed some Russian soldiers, and you're showing off that you've killed these other soldiers, the enemy, whether it's Russian, Ukrainian, vice versa. Russians do it, Ukrainians do it. Why would you then go through that extra effort of fucking sawing the guy's head off, putting it in a stove, and then posing with it with your very brand new, very prominent Ukrainian military football t-shirt? If you do it and you wanted to show it off as Ukrainian, which I'm sure, you know, it may have happened or similar things may have happened, you'd be smart enough to blur your face because you're going to get in trouble for that. You're not going to put yourself in the firing line as a soldier and get your ass handed to you by your commander. The SBU, the Ukrainian intelligence services, are going to arrest you for, you know, like releasing fucking propaganda that the Russians are going to use. It wouldn't benefit you in any way.
No, well,
So
that's probably a poor example on my behalf. But my point is that there is definite cases on both sides, yet one is held to account and one isn't. Now, of course, the Russians shouldn't be there. That's just a given.
But it is disproportionate. The amount of Russian war crimes compared to Ukrainians is disproportionately larger.
Of course it is. And I'm not saying, but I'm saying none of it's justified. I'm saying that
none of it, no,
if there's 100,000, then 100,000 are unjustified. If there's one, then one's unjustified. Every single one of them is unjustified.
100%.
But I hate the celebration of, and my whole thing. Maybe I'm just a peace junkie now, but I don't like the celebration of young men being, you know, who have just fought for their cause. They're not Putin. If it was Putin, whatever, or if it was, you know, but if it's just a young guy, and on that same, let's say the Americans beheaded all apparently half or more than half of the Japanese they captured around Pearl Harbor from shot down planes. Beheaded, and you know, there's a full thing on it.
Yeah, I don't know about that.
It's not an uncommon thing, and it's, you know, war crimes have been prevalent throughout history. My whole point is I hate that there's ever any avenue to be ever critical of the Ukrainians without someone saying you're pro-Russian, and it's like, no.
I agree with you. Yeah. I think, like, rather than, you know, we try and be as unbiased as we can because we want to give the audience watching this, we want to show people, you know, the trying to be, even though we're both in a position where we're more pro-Ukraine. I'm definitely pro-Ukraine. I served the Ukrainian military, and now I train Ukrainian soldiers. But I try and, you know, just deliver people what's actually going on. I don't want to bullshit people. I don't want to be, you know, some cheesy Legion guy telling war stories or some, you know, adamant pro-Ukrainian till I die kind of guy. I want to just say what I see and what's going on from my viewpoint. But I will say in this perspective, I'll sound pro-Ukrainian because it is one of those things. Obviously, it comes down to, like, okay, you don't want this to happen. You shouldn't be in Ukraine. Obviously, you shouldn't be in Ukraine. And then another thing, which is like, there's a great thing I see all the time, which is always shared. It's like a children's drawing of a Russian soldier standing over like a little kid or a girl about to shoot them. Very childish drawing, and it's shared a lot on Instagram. And it's like, I didn't do this, Putin did it. And it is one of those things. There is a majority of Russians that do support this war. The Russian soldiers do support this war. We obviously see, because it's trying to demoralize the enemy. So we see a lot of, you know, Russians surrendering, Russians not wanting to fight, Russians talking about how their equipment's bad. But they've been captured by Ukrainians at that point. So obviously they're just saying, you know, they're pro-Ukrainian thing. They're not going to say the truth. But it is very important to understand, like, they shouldn't be here, obviously. Ukrainian soldiers should be here. Two wrongs don't make a right, for sure. Two wrongs do not make a right. And you can't sit there and go, this war crime's okay because the Russians should be here, and this war crime's wrong because the Russians did it and they're here. Disproportionately huge amount of war crimes are committed by the Russians compared to the Ukrainians, but there is instances of Ukrainians doing it. And it was a big thing that I was very vocal about when I served in the Ukrainian military. It's like, we would get shelled. Everyone thinks the war before 24 February was nothing. We were just sitting in trenches doing nothing. But, you know, I lost 6 guys on my first rotation. I think we lost 4 on my second rotation, just from my company. It was very active. There's a lot of times I got very close to getting killed. Was in a lot of firefights, a lot of shelling. You know, there was a lot of times where we'd be like, you know, why we shouldn't be doing this, we shouldn't be firing. If they're not allowed to fire, but they would fire anyway, even when the OCSE was watching them. They didn't really care. Nobody held them accountable. They're separatists. We were held a lot more accountable than they were. But there'd be times when we would do things and I'd go, Like, we shouldn't really be doing that. You know, we shouldn't be, you know, and not in regards to shelling civilians, because again, nobody's ever going to believe me, but that fucking never happened, or it happened on such a low scale. Ukrainians weren't trying to kill Russian people in the Donbas. But when we would like shell enemy positions when we shouldn't have been using, you know, mortars at that time or at that point, or it wasn't justified, I'd be like, fuck, we shouldn't really be doing this because we're trying to be the good guys. And it's the same goes for this point of view. Obviously, what we say, people will say we're pro-Ukrainian. There is no middle ground. You can't be unbiased. You're either pro-Ukrainian or pro-Russian. There is no way to be a middle person. You tried your best, you know, making that thing. We personally discussed this, and I was quite vocal about my disagreement of you doing that, because even if you got to go there, you wouldn't have been able to control your flow of information, so you would have just been used as a puppet. So I disagreed with it on a personal level, but you did try. You know, you tried to say, hey, I will try and show you both sides of the war. And I've tried to do that with telling people my experiences from Bucha. I was the only foreigner that was there. I was the only foreigner that was, as well as people like Aiden, Shaun, and a few others. Yeah, it was just one of those things. Give me 2 seconds. So at the end of the day, there will always be, it's just a war. Like, yeah. And to be honest, do you think the fucking average Ukrainian soldier gives a fuck, like, that some, you know, keyboard warrior or some international organization, one of those useless ones like the UN or most of the Red Cross, do you think he gives a fuck what they say about him? He's defending his countries, you know, lost a lot of friends, lost a lot of people, lost a lot of land and his home and everything. Do you think he cares about what those organizations are about? Definitely not. So he's going to do his best job to try and free his land, free his country. It's obviously, regardless of what the pro-Russian people say, regardless of what the Russians say, this war isn't going the way they wanted it to go. More goodwill gestures and all this sort of thing. The war just isn't going the way they want it to go. So not only is it unjustified, or you can, you know, pro-Russian people say it's justified, Ukrainians say it's unjustified, but regardless if it's justified or not, it's not going well for them at the moment. No. So obviously you will see an increase of Russian disinformation to try and discredit the Ukrainians, like a skull in a cooking pot. Or, you know, there will be more different things. They will try and, as they're losing, because the most dangerous thing is a wounded beast. So as they're losing ground, as they're losing the war, as they're losing the support of the population, they will try and rally that support more through, you know, the most heinous methods that they can imagine. And it's not fucking out the realms of Russian possibility to stage a photo with a human skull. There was a Russian, some absolute dog of a human who took the skull of an Azov guy that died in Mariupol, took it to his music show. Is that some pro-Russian, some Russian metal band or whatever? Yeah. So, and look at the things that they, like, people forget. Fucking Russian poisoned people in our country. The Russians used Novichok to poison people in Salisbury in the UK. Yeah. It wasn't like some conspiracy theory that was like maybe linked to Russia. It was like it was the Russians. The Russian intelligence services assassinated people with poison and almost killed a bunch of other people with this poison in our country. In America, they've done it. Plutonium or uranium poisoning, whatever it was.
Yes,
it's not out the realms of possibility for the Russians to do this sort of thing. The Russians leveled Mariupol to the ground. They destroyed Grozny and Chechnya. The Russians have got a large track record of abominable things, both internally, externally, and obviously in support of their military operation. They don't have a very honourable track record. And like Emile said, it might not be the most justifiable thing. It was completely unjustified as going to places like Iraq and Afghanistan, and it's obviously bitten us on the arse in recent years. But we definitely don't have such a large track record. We didn't go in and level Baghdad. I've been to Baghdad. It's not leveled. It wasn't leveled. It was precision hit. It was like precise things were hit by like guided, precision-made munitions. And those munitions are designed to be the most effective and have the least collateral damage. The Russians don't have anything like that. You know, the Russian missiles that they launch every day at places like Kharkiv and Zaporizhia recently at the moment is getting it back. They're not like accurate. Their accuracy is off by at least 600 meters. So they don't care about, you know, killing civilians, where for the most part the Ukrainians do. If you look at the battle map, and since 2014-15, Ukrainians are literally on Donetsk's doorstep. You could shoot mortars at Donetsk. You can shoot very low-level weapons. They're that close to Donetsk. They haven't leveled it, even though it's full of these evil separatists and these Russian soldiers. They haven't leveled it. They could do, of course they could do. They could launch HIMARS at the government building in Donetsk, but they don't want to inflict civilian casualties as bad as the Russians do. And whether the Russians want to or not, they don't care if they do. So that's the difference, and that's where it comes down to.
And I agree, but saying that then Ukraine has not participated in civilian casualties is wrong.
I don't think anyone's saying that. Though. People aren't saying that they're not.
But it will never get picked up and spoken about. And if you do say, like, if I were to post that, look, this attack carried out killed then 15 civilians in this area, people's reaction would be, "Fuck you, you're pro-Russian." And what I'm saying is, you can be critical. You can be critical of both sides without agreeing with one. That's my point.
I think people get this big thing in their minds that, you know, old Vice was quite good and there is certain things that are good at being non-biased. People have this big thing in their mind that the news should be unbiased, the media should be unbiased, but the media has always be unbiased. Look at the American media empire. It was built as a support for political foundations. You have your Republican and your Democrat news facilities. You have two options. And even the ones that sit in the middle don't really sit in the middle. So to hold people to a standard and say, you should be unbiased, you should say about this. No, because the Western media supports Ukraine because it's in line with their government support of Ukraine. It's in line with just humanity support. You know, you've got to be pretty against basic humanity not to support Ukraine in this sort of thing. And even if you don't support Ukraine direct, supporting, you know, people's right to survive, people's right to self-determination, people's right just to fucking live. It's not about Ukraine establishing itself as a pro-NATO democratic state. It's about people being able to survive, because under Russian occupation, people aren't able to. They aren't able to live, you know, how normal human beings should live. Look at the videos from the referendum recently that are going around for people's security cameras. Because again, these Russians are the people that are doing the collaborators and stuff. They're just old Soviet idiots. They're going around with bored soldiers, because we're soldiers. We would know if you got put on that duty, you got to escort these old Soviet people around to knock on doors and take votes, which are one-sided anyway. If you were an average soldier, which, you know, the Russians are just soldiers, you'd be like, fuck, that's a shit duty, you know. Imagine you have to just walk around all day with some old people collecting votes. If you were a soldier, if we got asked to do that in the British or the Australian army, you'd be like, fuck's sake, it's a shit job to get given. So those soldiers are bored. You've got these, you know, fanatical Soviet collaborators who are collecting the vote, and they're going around with armed people. And people can say they're protecting themselves against Ukrainian partisan attack, but it's also an intimidation tactic. And I highly doubt, you know, what you're going to, you think really that anyone that takes that vote is going to sit there and go, no, I want to be in Ukraine. I don't want Russian occupation. Well, there's like two Chechens standing outside with guns. Fuck no, I wouldn't do that. I don't have the balls to do that. It's potentially suicide. I'm not saying they're just executing people in their homes if they go.
Oh, sorry, you just cut out then. You cut out after it's potentially suicide.
Yeah, no, it's a bit sketchy. Yeah, I wouldn't. You'd have to be a very brave person to sit there in the face of the occupation authorities and say you're pro-Ukrainian.
But you and I know that there are people in those areas too who are diehard Russians too in occupied territory.
Of course there is. Yeah, of course there is.
Absolute, like I had a fixer before the war, and on the 24th of February with himself, he was literally like this, like the saviors have come. He was honestly ringing his wife like a Christian would ring if Jesus came back down. He's like, "Yep, we're saved. The Russians are coming." And this is something a lot of people
saved from what though? That's what. That's what I say to people. Saved from what? Was there a genocide going on? I speak Russian. I don't speak Ukrainian very rarely. I do speak, you know, Ukrainianized Russian because I learned it in Ukraine. But I speak Russian. I spent most of my time in the east of Ukraine, around Mariupol, you know, defending that area. You know, there isn't. I've had like maybe two people in my military career in the Ukrainian military say, "Why don't you speak Ukrainian?" And they were like, you know, West Ukrainians had no idea about, you know, the real situation in the east. Nobody. There isn't a conquest against the Russian language. If I, as a foreigner, can get away with speaking Russian in the Ukrainian military for 3 years and continuing to do it at this point when I train military units and civilians, there fucking isn't a problem. Someone would have clipped me by now, punched me, or told me otherwise. There isn't a problem. So liberating them from what? And
my point is more people don't believe that there's anyone like that. No, there are people like that. And they have it, and it is.
Of course there is. Yeah, of course there is.
Yeah, it's a graduation goggles from the Soviet Union. That is 30 years ago.
Ukraine has been a fractured state. You know.
Yeah.
History of Ukraine. A lot of West Ukraine was part of the Polish Empire at one point, and vice versa. And Obviously, the eastern parts are very deep into Russian territory. Especially the Donbas area is very industrialized. So, you know, those industrial areas were built by the Soviets. They were staffed and worked by Soviet people from all over the Soviet Union. So it inherited a very Soviet atmosphere. It's very Soviet over there. You've been there yourself, Mariupol as well. Those places, the steelworks and everything. They're just Soviet construction. Yeah, doesn't mean it's, you know, a Russian thing, but there obviously is a pro-Russian element there. And anyone that denies that is an idiot, because otherwise we wouldn't be in the situation we were in now. 2014 wouldn't have happened if there wasn't the desire and Russia's ability to backpack off a revolution. As small as it was, because the Ukrainians did, people don't know this, but the Ukrainians basically did defeat the separatists. So they were on the verge of defeating them. They captured a lot of the areas back. So there was a lot of pro-Ukrainians. They were on the verge of defeating them at the Bucha. And the Russian army stormed in over the border and surrounded the Ukrainian army who weren't ready for it, and pushed them back and then established contact points. So, you know, just some of the things people say are mental, and some of the things Ukrainians say are mental. You know what I mean? Like, I used to say to people all the time, I was like, you know, I couldn't really envision Crimea being returned to Ukraine. Now I actually can, because with the weapons that we have. Because the weapons that we have and the freedom that we have to use them, you know, we do have the military potential to do that now. We didn't really have that military edge to be able to go on a wide offensive, and probably that's why it hasn't happened for so many years. But now Ukrainians do, and they prove that they have that potential to do it.
It's things in the last month have just changed so dramatically and in the beginning of the war, mate, when I was there, the weeks leading up and in the beginning of it, I was 100% on the side of Ukraine has no chance in this, because I would believe the West propaganda about the powerfulness of Russia. Like I fully believed it would be the same if America went, fuck it, we're invading Mexico. That's what I was like.
I was sat in Bucha.
Power shuffle. I
sat in Bucha when it happened. I woke up the morning to the missile strikes. I watched the 40 odd helicopters flying to Gostomel, big air assault, Russian jets flying over my house. All the airports were bombed, and it looked very hopeless. And obviously the Russians, the lead elements advanced very quickly. They weren't capable of doing the job they were assigned to do, but they did advance very, very quickly. Like, a lot of Russians went through Bucha before the Russians even captured it, like a week before the Russians even captured it. Russians advanced through Bucha, secure around Kiev. And I think everyone thought that. And obviously, you know, this is one of those things that anti-Ukrainians in the West harp on about. You'd be nothing. You'd all be dead if it weren't for our weapons. Of course. And I'll say it again. I said it in my interview with you. Those weapons are useless unless they're in the hands of motivated people that are willing to defend their homes. Because how much fucking weapons and kit did we give to the Iraqis that surrendered in Mosul, that made ISIS as powerful they were? The Iraqi division surrendered in Mosul, gave them all their American equipment. How powerful did we make the Afghan National Army through years and years of very high-level mentorship and training programs, and trillions of dollars of high-level equipment? They folded in 2 weeks. Ukraine will not fold ever, because they've been given the tools to do it, and tools are only useful in the hands of a skilled craftsman and a motivated craftsman. Otherwise, tools are useless.
And something I do want to talk about, I guess, to change the topic a little bit, because you and I spoke offline about this, was a bit of OSINT from around finding Russian bodies and the slowness of the advance due to seeing the decomposing bodies. I've only got a shitty dot point note here about that.
Well, it's something that I've been doing personally, as well as a few other OSINT people, and it's just from what I had to follow some Russian Telegram groups at the beginning of the war to ascertain who from my unit and my friends who survived in Mariupol, who was captured, who was killed, and then as I followed them over the last 6-7 months, and you know, anyone can disagree with this point. I urge you, go look in some of their Telegram groups, and you'll see I'm talking just complete truth. Exclusively, almost, I'd say more than 95%, maybe even higher, of the pictures that Russians post in their Telegram groups, especially compared to what the Ukrainians post in their Telegram groups, almost exclusively what the Ukrainians post are very fresh bodies that have just been killed, and they're advancing over those bodies. Whereas the Russian Telegram groups, or the pro-Russian Telegram groups, they post almost exclusively decomposing bodies, almost skeletal bodies, maggot infested, bloated bodies, which shows that those people have been killed, and the Russians have only got there, and the pictures you can tell are being took by frontline guys, not high quality journalist pictures that have come weeks afterwards or days afterwards. They're guys that have taken it as they got to this position. It shows that the Russians are killing people, then advancing onto those positions very slowly. The Ukrainians are also really good at getting rid of their bodies. That's why we didn't really know Ukrainian casualties at the beginning, because especially in the like Kiev, Chernihiv, Sumy regions, even Ukrainian civilians would move the bodies so the Russians can, work out or post pictures of them. So we didn't see any real Ukrainian casualties at the beginning, even though there was obviously Ukrainian casualties. But so we see exclusively almost the Russians are posting decomposing bodies, Ukrainian troops that have been killed, and that they're, again, almost exclusively that all those people, even if the body's decomposing, their boots have been removed. The boots have been removed because a Russian soldier's taken them to change his boots. So that really showed two things to me. It showed that the Russians are advancing slowly. It shows that they're advancing on areas that the Ukrainians couldn't get to get their bodies out. So the Ukrainians were locked off from that area for an extended period of time to retrieve their bodies. One second, sorry, mate. And it also shows that the Russian army is very poorly equipped compared to the Ukrainian army. The Ukrainian army is not the best equipped in the world, not compared to our militaries, but they've got great boots. The Talan boots are very sturdy, very good boots. The Russians are taking their equipment and they're advancing very slowly, and that is something that the Russians have provided to us. The Russians have provided that information, so that's not from a pro-Ukrainian source. That's what the Russians are releasing to people. So they're sort of, by trying to show off, hey, look, we killed these Ukrainian soldiers, we killed these fascists or whatever. They're actually exposing their weaknesses, which is a slow advance, a frigid advance, and also a very under-equipped army.
Yeah, I can completely sympathise that we've been going almost 2 hours now. But just in finishing, you're out there with the boys every day with soldiers out near the front. Can you give us a quick, if you've got any sort of information on how people are feeling about these Iranian drones that seem to have a large effect, or if you had any exposure to them, and how guys are feeling with winter sort of knocking on the door and it plummeting in temperature?
To be honest, it's another thing. It's something that Russia using these drones and having to buy Iranian drones is more of a show of Russian weakness and Russian failure, desperacy, than it is a show of strength. These drones, you've seen the videos of them. They're huge loitering drones. They were built for certain conflicts that Iran could be involved in. They weren't built to do what the Russians are doing. Like go up against coordinated air defense, and especially. It's obviously been in Ukraine a bit longer because we're seeing a lot of good air defense success in the last few months. But Zelensky just officially announced that they have the NSAMs or NASAMs or whatever, which is an incredible thing that could take down any Russian jet with ease. It would literally block an airspace for Russian jets. So the fact that they're using these drones really hasn't made much of a difference. It's them. We were using, either improvised or very good, like Switchblade, kamikaze drones, suicide drones against the Ukrainians, against the Russians that the Americans gave us. And it's the Russians trying to even the playing field. And the only person they can turn to is Iran. And obviously Iran has its own problems at the moment. And there's, a very, don't hold your breath. We saw it in Belarus. It looked like it was going to happen, but it didn't. There's a very high chance the Iranian regime will change soon, or will at least have some sort of knockback. It's an internal dispute. It's not about Russia, but the new regime could stop supporting Russia. And it isn't really in anyone's best interest to support Russia at the moment. They are the losing side, and nobody likes to bet on a loser.
Yeah. And the feeling amongst winter, is that going to change the way the guys are operating? Is that
concerning? They become more static.
Yeah.
They become more static again. I think that's why Ukraine are trying these big offensives now to capture back as much ground as they can. If it becomes, the war will just naturally slow down in the winter. But the Russians, it's always been historically known, the Nazis, Hitler invading Russia, Barbarossa, Stalingrad, and Napoleon's sort of disastrous invasion of Russia. It's always been known as, like, you don't invade Russia because the winter will get you. I think the Russians are about to get a taste of that for the first time in their history. Right. Don't invade, another cold country in the winter if you're under equipped. And I don't think the Russians are going to be equipped for winter.
Yeah. Do you think
Ukrainians are very resistant to the cold?
Do you think though, because with Russia being more of a artillery power, and I guess Ukraine being more that having the more artillery, do you think as it slows down they could have the advantage just from that pure numbers of guns and shells?
Well, it's great if you can put 50 guns on a line and set them up, but obviously counter battery, and Ukraine with the HIMARS now has much more effective counter battery, and I'm pretty sure like the M777 that has a longer range than most Russian artillery. And then Ukraine also has a lot of the same artillery as the Russians, like the Pion system, which can fire like above 50 kilometers. Ukraine has that as 100 kilogram shell. The Russians obviously don't have the advantage, and it's great having those guns. But if all of your ammo dumps keep getting destroyed, which again isn't a pro-Ukrainian concept, it's evident, it's true. They're hitting.
Oh no, it's happening. It's 100% hitting.
Happening, yeah. They're hitting ammo dumps every fucking day, multiple ones every day. So if you've got no place to consolidate and secure your ammo dumps are not really going to be a thing they can keep doing in the future. They're not going to be able to consolidate ammo, which means their logistics are slow down. So they're not going to be able to keep up that volume of fire, which they need to be able to advance.
And how much of a thing would it be if the HIMARS became ineffective? Just due to there's been a lot of people saying that the S-400s could be deployed with some like AI update to actually hit HIMARS. Would that be catastrophic, or would it just be we're just moving into something else?
It's the same bullshit they said before, though, isn't it?
Yeah, I agree.
The same bullshit they said about all their technology. Yeah, like we're gonna. It's like the Wish.com robot dog we spoke about. It's just embarrassing. It's like, what? Okay, if you've got the S-400 and it's great and it can do this and do that, why hasn't it been deployed? And it was shown to be ineffective in Armenia. It couldn't take down Bayraktars. Hasn't been effective in Syria at taking down the newer technology. And also the HIMARS fired a bunch of rockets. Yeah. And you have to remember that all these things were developed. Things like a HIMARS wasn't developed for Iraq or Afghanistan. It's not useful in those conflicts. No, those things have all been developed to go up against, the near peer enemies, and what we fought with near peer enemies. So Russia, China, stuff like that. So they've been built to defeat those systems. Yes. I'm sure the HIMARS, one of the main considerations in its development or in its upgrades, etc., was the ability to defeat the S-400.
Of course, it would have been. Yes.
Exactly. So I don't think it's going to make any difference really. Air power wise, we use very similar jets. Will Ukraine get some updated jets? Potentially not. It's hard to train people, and it's not really needed. Just give them the old Soviet jets. The air battle is constantly going on, but the Russians lost a lot of aircraft in the past few days, a lot of high-tech aircraft as well.
Yeah, well, there's four confirmed, and two of them were like Su-30s, which are pretty.
Yeah, Su-30s are the newer ones. Yeah, I don't know, and and this is mainly talking to those pro-Russian people out there that comment on my last video. Will comment on this as well. It just, regardless of if you feel good about Russia or Ukraine, the war isn't. Russia are losing the war, and I really can't see a way out of it for them that's positive, other than total, redeployment, total, scale down of the conflict, a conditional. It won't be a surrender because it's not a military operation. It's not a war. Sorry, it'll be a withdrawal. But the Russian Putin has to justify that to his people. Maybe he's going to push them to the point where they suffer so much that getting out of the war is actually a positive for them. That's what I could see happening. The war gets so bad for them that actually he manages to recoup it by withdrawing, goodwill gesture, and the Russian life gradually goes back to normal. And I hope people, even the people that support the war in Ukraine, I hope that their lives do go back to normal. As much as I hope our lives go back to normal. I hope that the Russian people can just continue living the way they want to live. If that be under Putin, if that be under that regime, if that's what they want, they should be able to do that. And the Ukrainian people should be allowed to continue their lives without being constantly shelled with rockets. I would not totally agree with it, but yeah, like if you're going to launch rockets and you're going to hit military targets and cities and stuff, go ahead. It's a war. But just launching just random, uncoordinated, inaccurate rockets on civilians for no reason. It's not breaking the Ukrainian people. There's people out in the streets every day. You'll see dead bodies on the streets where Russian shelling has killed people, and people will just carry on with their day. It's not going to break them. And I just hope that people can just go back to living the lives they want to live. And nobody should be suffering because of one man or one, harem of corrupt, evil, sort of self-centered people like Putin and his inner circle. Nobody should be suffering because of those small individuals. Yeah.
That includes the people suffering. Like, there shouldn't be Russians in Russia suffering because of them either. I mean, as far as
it's one thing. I would have agreed with you a while ago, but then it's getting to the point now when it is like I would have agreed with you a few weeks ago, or a few months ago, maybe. I would have said, yeah, they shouldn't suffer because of their leader. But it is the Russian people as well. Not all of them, but a majority of them. And look at these protests. It's pathetic. And the protests don't make me happy. They make me angry. But these cowards supported the war and they let the war happen. They didn't do anything about it. But then when it's their turn to go fight in it, they're fleeing the country and everything like that. And I think that all these other countries should close their borders. Close their borders to these Russians trying to flee conscription. Because really they should have done something about it before. They should have done something on the first week of the war, not to allow this to happen.
Yeah, it's a very difficult debate to have of, people who shouldn't have let this happen. It's a very back and forward of, and a lot of people say we shouldn't have let that happen. But if they were in that situation, that they would have been the same. It's the same as people. 100% of people will go, if I lived in Germany in the 40s, I would have pushed back against the Nazis.
No, they wouldn't have. No,
sorry, not. Yeah. But 99% of you wouldn't have.
Yeah, and then the vast majority of the German people supported Hitler.
Was stepping on.
Exactly.
Yeah. But it's very. You see this in the West when people will. Oh no, I would, and you're like, bullshit. Like it's like,
again, but it's one of those things that like the vast majority of German people supported Hitler. Not for, there was obviously a lot of people that supported, the killing of Jews, minorities, and things like that. But most of those people supported Hitler because of, the retaining returning Germany's pride, yes, and returning Germany's land and expanding Germany's power. That's why they supported him, not because they're all Nazis and wanted to kill the Jews, etc. And the same way a lot of people in Russia probably support the war because they want to see a return to Russia's prestige. Yes. They want to probably see a return to the Russian Empire, the Soviet Empire. They want those things back. They probably don't support, the killing of innocent people in Bucha or these other places, but they do support that they may compartmentalize it, I think is the correct word, and say, well, I'll ignore that because I want this, yes. And I think that's why a lot of them do support it. But it's very cowardly of them.
Humans are great at ignoring things unless it has a direct effect on you too.
Exactly, yeah.
Exactly. We can talk about, Russians should have, they've only now started to protest because, there's now an effect of the conscription. But at the same time, you're like, well, would have we given a fuck about Ukraine if it didn't directly affect our oil and gas and potential NATO borders? Because things like this happen all around the world, and we go, oh yeah, but it's in this country, it's this country.
I think in a lot of ways,
affecting you, people then like, oh shit, I'm a big fan of this. But unless it affects
you, yeah.
And
if it didn't affect them before, they wouldn't have given a fuck. And it's one of those things like, this is I think a wake up call in a lot of ways. Like, hey, you shouldn't be reliant on Russia, a very fickle, a very bad state for our gas. Like, it's not like, oh God, because of Ukraine, because of this war, that doesn't really affect me. My gas prices are going up, which does affect me. It's one of those things where, should you have been relying on Russian gas in the first place? No.
Yeah, that was the most stupid fucking thing Europe had ever done.
It's the same with a lot of things. Like, Saudi Arabia, great. I love it. It's great that they helped negotiate the release of the guys, especially the foreign guys and stuff like that, recently in the prison exchange. Saudi Arabia is one of the most evil states on this earth.
Yes.
It's undeniably an incredibly bad state, but we sell them the most weapons. We do the most business with them because we rely on them on certain things.
Yes.
Is that right? Is it the way the world works? Definitely so. But it's probably a wake-up call that Russia, the country that destroyed Chechnya a bunch of times, Russia, the country that unjustly invaded Georgia, Russia, the country that have assassinated people in the UK, the US, and in Europe, Russia, the country that imprisons people for being homosexual, expressing their freedoms, Russia, the country that has had a dictatorship and the same leader in power for God knows how many years. Russia, the country that invaded a sovereign state in 2014, whether they deny it or not, it's very obvious that it was. And Russia, a country that has now done this in Ukraine. Should we have been relying on them and buying them gas and supporting that regime that props up so much evil? Definitely not.
But my point is, humans and people will turn a blind eye to that until it starts affecting them. We all know that Russia did that. We all know Russia. Now, I'm not European myself, of course, I'm Australian, but every European knew that they did evil shit. But
yeah,
hey, gas is fucking cheap. I'll turn a blind eye to that. And we do that all over the fucking world with people jump up and down about climate change and use their fucking iPhone that's made in a sweatshop. And you're like, hang on, unless it starts affecting you. And that's a bit of my point to do with these people in Russia. I think a lot of people go, of course it's fucking evil, but it didn't affect us.
It didn't affect them exactly.
And I think it's a bit naive for like a lot of people to say, well, I would have, but you didn't. Like you should have.
Yeah, and Russia's a huge country as well. Like how much does a sanction affect someone in Yakutia or Siberia? It doesn't really affect them because they don't go out and they probably don't use, Instagram as much and stuff like that. So it doesn't really affect those people in the east, like the east of Russia. The sanctions don't really affect them. So, and it's the same where, there's air raid alerts every single second. There'll be one starting, here in a short amount of time. Every place in Ukraine is under threat at any moment.
Yes.
It's a huge country, so it's not like, the chances are astronomically low, but everywhere in Ukraine, in the territory of Ukraine, is under threat. That doesn't go for Russia. There is almost, apart from places like Belgorod, and rightly so that they do launch attacks in Belgorod because it's where majority of the missiles come from that land into Kharkiv. Yes. There is no danger living anywhere in Russia. You're not going to get any danger. There's danger living in Donetsk or Luhansk People's Republics, right? So those people are under threat of, Ukrainian actions and in occupied areas because it is Ukraine. But the Russian people aren't under threat. Ukrainians aren't threatening them. They never really have. But the Russians have constantly threatened Ukraine. They've constantly been a threat to Ukraine. 2014 and before. And they're a threat to every other former Soviet country.
You are in regards, if you live in Moscow, you're not under threat from a bomb landing on your head. But if you're out there with a poster,
you're under threat from your regime. You're under threat from your own regime.
And that's my thing, is you're under threat from your regime, because it is. Yeah. I'm sure that's and I like to think that the majority of humans are good people, except for mob mentality. And I'd like to think a lot of Russians, like, we know this is fucking crazy. But it's pretty easy for me, like an Australian like myself, to sit in my fucking home in Adelaide and go, if my government did that, I would be out there. But
people wouldn't, you know what I mean?
But the thing is, I'd like to say that, but I'm a fucking Australian. It's the Australian government. It's not the Kremlin. It's not these people that will lock you up for kissing other men. That's the difference.
Exactly.
I think
that's the difference.
It's a very rich of someone to sit in Belgium or sit in Amsterdam in the Netherlands to be like, I would, because it's not the same. And because the humans there are under threat from a regime. It's a lot different.
I think and the societal difference in Russia as well, the Soviet mindset of a lot of people and the Russian mindset of a lot of people is very different from any other country. And I think there was I've only watched a couple of her videos, so I may get ripped apart. She may have been like some super pro-Russian before the war started or something, and she's just changed now. I don't know. But I think her name's like Natalia's Adventure, something beautiful, absolutely a stunning young girl. She does like blogging. I think she's got a hell of a lot of subscribers on YouTube. And I watched one of her videos where she was still in Moscow or wherever she lives, in Petersburg or something. And she was talking quite freely. And I've been watching some of these people in Russia that are critical and, or just say the truth, not critical, but say the truth. And I'm like, how do they get away with that? And it's obviously not, you can't say one bad thing and then you're going to get put in prison for 10 years. Obviously, there is some freedom. But and she recently just escaped to Armenia. Or Azerbaijan or fucking Georgia or somewhere she just recently escaped to. And it was horrible watching it. She looked so tired, so stressed, and she obviously felt like the time was coming where she would be arrested soon, or she would be attacked for her YouTube channel and her beliefs. And it was horrible watching that. She's having to leave her home, regardless of if her home is evil or not, or they're bad people or not, or Russia's the bad person. That's her home. And the fact that she had to leave it because of the state that things are. She was walking around Moscow, that was it. And she was showing how she was like, she felt so oppressed by these posters and these billboards and announcing mobilization, disease everywhere. It's quite oppressive for her, and I'm sure it is for a lot of people in the west of Russia who are more westernized, in places like Moscow and St. Petersburg, who are just trying to get on with their lives, no control over what goes on in the government, and then they're being very oppressed by this system. And we're very lucky that we don't really have that. The war in Iraq and Afghanistan affected us in the UK and the US, like casualties. We didn't suffer. We didn't really get many attacks back because the Taliban have never attacked us. Saddam never attacked us. So it didn't really affect us. Whereas these people are actually being affected by this war that someone else is waging. Will they revolt and change the regime? Definitely not. The Russian state is too powerful internally, and especially the older generation will never turn on the Russian state. So the younger generation, unfortunately, this is just an honest opinion. The younger generation in today's world are a lot weaker than the older generation. The older generation that survived in the Soviet Union are quite hardy people, whereas the new people are, and we see it in our countries as well, younger generation, Gen Z or millennials, they are a lot weaker, whether it be mentally or physically. So for them to go up against a very powerful state institution isn't really possible in Russia. So I don't think we'll see a forced regime change, but we'll definitely see something in the future.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to follow along as it happens, because something has to give somewhere. And something will give. And I believe very soon something will give. As in the conditions are getting more and more difficult in Ukraine and Russia, as it plummets into cold, the gas gets expensive, whatever. I believe something will give sooner rather than later.
It has to, yeah. This isn't another 8-year war. Maybe people said that in 2014, but the intensity of this war and the repercussions on both sides for this war and really Russia's really going at it alone. They really are going at it alone. They are a big country. They do have a lot of equipment and material strength and resources, but they are really going into this war alone. And the way it's turned out for them is that they're really up against the world, or at least the Western world. I think even they had some summit recently of allied countries, and even the Indian Prime Minister even said to Putin, like, this is, what he said publicly, what he said privately was probably even harsher. What are you doing? This is damaging all of us. Nobody's really gaining anything from this. And even if they say that the tables reverse for whatever reason in the future, the Russians manage to achieve military objectives or achieve victory, who benefits from that? The Russians won't benefit from it. The Ukrainians will just fight forever. They will just fight forever. They'll never give up. So the Russians won't really gain anything.
But that's why I thought when I was here in, before the war, when I was in Ukraine, that's why I thought they'd never invade. Because I had this opinion, the Russia's the biggest landmass in the world. And I was like, even if they're successful in taking the whole of Ukraine, the cost it will cost, both financially and in men, is not worth gaining this pocket of land. And that was my opinion of why I could never. That's why I was like, when I first went to Ukraine, I'm like, oh yeah, I'm coming here because I believe they're going to invade. Once I got there, I'm like, oh, they're not going to invade. This is not going to.
I didn't believe it either. They didn't believe it. Showing me like all the people that have been here before. The Ukrainians didn't really believe it for the most part. I don't know what they. I think the main reason was it was Putin trying to last so long. We don't know, but he does look sickly. There's been a lot of studies on it. He's potentially got cancer or something else. But look at you. You've got a few forms of it, and you look clean, mate.
I'm going to invade a country.
I know, yeah, but you look fine. Whereas Putin looks very haggard, and he doesn't look great. And is it a last hurrah for him, or is it trying to return some sort of Russian pride, some Russian empire, like Soviet territories? Potentially, that's the only reason for it.
See, I just think I disagree. I think we just called his bluff. That they never actually wanted to do it. It was, we're doing it, building it, and eventually they'll give. It was like, if we put enough shit, Ukraine will fold. Eventually they'll fold.
It'd be easy. I think it would be easy for them.
They got to this point on the 23rd where they're like, we can't keep being the boy who cries. We need to do it. And that's why nothing was planned right. It was like,
I think there's definitely, from my evidence and the high level people that I've spoke to in Ukraine, and politicians, locals, businessmen, this has been planned for a long time. Like, you'll find that you've been to Ukraine, the road systems up near the Belarusian and Russian border are great, whereas the roads internally in Ukraine or in the south, not near Crimea, are shit. But so there's been a lot of pro-Russian influence and businessmen that have built the roads up in preparation for the invasion over the last few years.
Yeah.
This has, when the build-up was happening, and you know, it was a practice run for this. So it's not something. It wasn't a spur of the moment decision. It's been built up for a long time. I think they thought it'd be easy, and then I think they got so deep into it that there's sort of no way out. And I hope they find a way out for their sake, for our sake.
But well, that is I don't want to use the word genius because it's not genius, but that is the one massive benefit of them calling it a special operation. And it was a very clever move, whatever, to call it a special op, because you can at any point, I guess, back out. A war is you're waging war in a country, you're not ending until that country doesn't exist, or one surrenders. Where a special operation, at least there can be an out of, oh, well, our operation's done, we've got what we want, goodbye. And try and sell it to you as we achieved our operation. So if their special operation is, and that's the great thing, is they never put really defined, like something, there was some terms, but never like fully defined, we're taking XXX, that's it. It was running a special operation against this. And, you know, Russia could turn around if they can find out, go, we've achieved the special operation, we're pulling out.
Yeah, they keep changing their goals. Yeah.
But even if you and I know, hang on, you came in, you took no land, you took tens of thousands of casualties, what the fuck was, but if you can sell it, that was one clever.
You can sell it, yeah. It's one of those, they don't need to sell it to the West, they just need to sell it to their own people. And I think potentially they could have stopped or taken Mariupol as a victory. The problem was, which they underestimated, was that obviously Azov is the most spoken about one, but there was a lot of other people there. There was my brigade, the 36th Brigade, the 35th Brigade, a lot of National Guard, a lot of police, a lot of other military units. It wasn't just Azov. Obviously, Azov held up the longest, and they arguably were the best fighters there. They were, you know, at special forces level for Ukrainian standards. Most of those Azov guys are incredibly well-trained soldiers. And I think that if they captured Mariupol the way they wanted to capture it, rather than destroying the entire city, like leveling the entire city, and then also being fucking held up for weeks and weeks by small pockets of resistance. And the Azov battalion isn't huge. You know, they had, like, the Azov store became such a symbol of resistance.
Of course.
That there was no, even when they won, because they won on the Ukrainian terms. The Ukrainians, those guys, you know, they held up the Russians long enough there for the Ukrainians to get their shit sorted in the east in Donbas. So the Ukrainians achieved their goal in Mariupol by holding out that goal. They became figures of resistance. They made the Russian army look stupid. I know from personal accounts of guys that were there that at one point it was up to 12-1. The Ukrainians were outnumbered 12-1. It was something like 10% of the entire Russian military, not what was involved in Ukraine, the entire Russian military, 10% of it was focused just on Mariupol. And those guys held out for weeks and weeks and weeks, living in, you know, factories and in tunnels and bunkers. So they couldn't pull Mariupol as a victory. They couldn't do a victory parade through the streets because it was littered with decomposing corpses and burnt out buildings. So they haven't been able to pull a victory out. They didn't capture Kiev. They didn't capture Chernihiv. They didn't capture Sumy. They didn't capture Kharkiv. They didn't capture Kramatorsk, Svetlodar. They didn't capture Mariupol. They didn't capture Mykolaiv. So they haven't really been able to pull out a presentable victory yet. Maybe they're trying to do that. But, you know, can they even, if the Ukrainians start pushing back past the lines before February the 24th, are they going to really hold out? You know, if I was a separatist, when Kharkiv fell, the Kharkiv region was liberated, the first thing the separatists did was get a referendum together to try and join Russia again, which they've tried dozens of times since 2014, and the Russians say no every time. And then as soon as Kharkiv region fell, they were like, Luhansk is going to be next. Donetsk is going to be next. We need to get in Russia ASAP. Russia are going to save us. I don't think the Russians will. I don't think the Russians are going to tie themselves to that state. It's not valuable for them. The Russian people don't want Donetsk and Luhansk. They've exposed themselves as really inept criminal governments, and we'll hear more about it now. The guys are free. The war crimes. You know, Shaun and Aiden was stabbed. You know, for no reason. They were, you know, just because they were captured, they'd already surrendered. They were stabbed, they were beaten. Shaun was electrocuted. Shaun was starved. He's emancipated, and so they're exposing themselves as war criminals. The Russian intelligence services executed and assassinated most of the separatist leaders after 2014, 2015, because they were all war criminals, failed soldiers, just really bad people for the Russians to have as figureheads of their new state. So the Russians executed all of them. They said the Ukrainians did it, but it's so obvious the Russians did it. They executed all their separatist leaders. They're not proud of that state. They don't want it. And will they risk the Russian state collapsing over defending those territories? I think not. If I was a separatist right now, or I was someone who's pro-separatism or pro-Russian in those territories, I'd be pretty worried at this point, because the clock is ticking on their survivability as a so-called republic.
Yeah. Well, mate, look, it's been what, 2.5 years?
Oh, mate, yeah, we've cracked it out. We love chatting. I'm surprised if people listen this long. You know, I can't listen to myself this long. I love talking. So,
well, mate,
if you listen this long, congratulations.
Yeah,
you
congratulations,
made it through
you made it through. No,
well
I do
done.
really appreciate you coming on. You know, sticking your neck out a little bit and helping me. You know, my whole goal is just to be as realistic as I can in my reporting.
I try to be as well, mate. I'm not a reporter. I am pro-Ukrainian, but I do try and just be honest and say what I see. And you know, no, people aren't going to believe it because of my background. But at the end of the day, I just want, you know, I want to give. This is my home. You know, my house was damaged during the war. I've lost pretty much majority of my friends in this war, and I want it to end for everyone's sake. And I just want people back home and the people that watch this just to understand what's going on. And see it from a real point of view. I will plug obviously my Instagram, which is @Rugi, which hopefully you'll put down in the description. During my interview, a lot of people were asking for it, so there's my Instagram, and follow what we do. And then obviously @Trident Defence Initiative on Instagram and tridentdefenceinitiative.com if you'd like to support our organisation. And we're not just we do train the Ukrainian military, but we do also provide community support and training for civilians. And we're not. My organisation isn't, we're training Ukrainian soldiers to kill orcs. No, we're not training Ukrainian soldiers to kill and maim and hurt people. We're training them to defend their land, defend their people, and to be able to defend civilians and defend the freedom of their country. That's why it's a defence initiative.
Awesome, mate. Well, look, thanks again.
Cheers,
look forward to the next chat. Hopefully the next chat I'm back in Ukraine. That'd be great.
That'd be awesome. Yeah, we'll sit down for a beer.
We will. Righto, mate. Cheers for that.
Cheers, buddy.